Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Before we begin tonight's journey into darkness, I'm curious to know where you're listening from. Are you tucked away in your bedroom in a quiet suburb? Perhaps lying in bed in a city apartment with the sounds of traffic filtering through your windows? Or maybe you're somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the night feels a little too close, a little too present. And what time is it where you are? Is it that perfect witching hour when the world feels suspended between day and tomorrow? When shadows seem to move just slightly differently than they should? Wherever you are, whatever time it is, you've chosen to spend these next few hours with stories that blur the line between what we know to be real and what we desperately hope remains fiction. So settle in, close your eyes if you can, and let me take you into the darkness. The rain had been falling in Millbrook Heights for 3 days straight when Sarah Chun first noticed the man standing across from her apartment building. It was November 2025, and the perpetual drizzle that had settled over the Portland suburb seemed to wash all the color from the world, leaving everything in shades of gray that matched the November sky. Sarah lived on the 4th floor of Meridian Towers, a modern complex that had sprung up in what used to be farmland just 5 years earlier. The building was surrounded by others just like it, each one filled with young professionals who worked downtown and drove electric cars and ordered their groceries online. It was the kind of place where neighbors nodded politely in hallways, but never learned each other's names, where the sound of someone walking in the apartment above became as familiar as your own. Heartbeat. Sarah worked as a data analyst for a tech company downtown, spending her days staring at screens filled with numbers that told stories about consumer behavior and market trends. She was 28, lived alone except for a cat named Pixel, and had moved to Millbrook Heights because the rent was reasonable and the commute to downtown was manageable on the light rail. She had a small circle of friends, mostly co-workers, and dated occasionally, but nothing serious. Her life was orderly, predictable, safe. At least, it had been until she started noticing the man. He first appeared on a Tuesday evening when she was making dinner, standing under the streetlight across from her building's main entrance. Sarah's apartment faced east, and from her living room window, she had a clear view of Hawthorne Street and the small pocket park that sat between her building and the next complex over. The man was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket with the hood pulled up against the rain. What caught her attention wasn't his presence, exactly, but the way he stood perfectly still, like a statue that someone had placed there and forgotten. Most people walking in the rain hurried, hunched their shoulders, moved with purpose. This man simply stood there, and though Sarah couldn't make out his face from 4 floors up, she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was looking directly at her window. She watched him for perhaps 10 minutes while her pasta boiled, expecting him to move along, to check his phone, to show some sign of life. But he remained motionless, and when Sarah finally turned away to drain the pasta and returned to the window, he was gone. She told herself it was nothing, just someone waiting for a ride or taking a phone call. But something about the stillness of his posture lingered in her mind as she ate dinner alone and watched Netflix until it was time for bed. The next evening, he was back. Same spot, same posture, same unsettling stillness. This time Sarah noticed that he seemed to be wearing the same dark jacket, hood up despite the fact that the rain had stopped that afternoon. She found herself drawn to the window, checking periodically as she went about her evening routine of cleaning up, doing a load of laundry, video calling her sister in San Francisco. Each time she looked, he was there. And each time she looked away and back again, she had the growing certainty that he hadn't moved at all, not even to shift his weight or check the time by Thursday. Sarah had started timing his appearances. He showed up at exactly 6:47 p.m. and remained until 9:23 p.m. She knew because she had become obsessed with watching him, drawn to the window despite the chill that seemed to settle in her chest every time she confirmed he was still there. She tried taking photos with her phone, but the distance and the evening light made it impossible to make out any details. All she could capture was a dark silhouette under the streetlight, looking for all the world like a shadow that had somehow become detached from whatever cast it. On Friday evening, Sarah decided to do something about it. She couldn't concentrate on work, couldn't enjoy her usual weekend plans of meeting friends for drinks, couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. As 6:45 p.m. approached, she positioned herself at the window with a pair of binoculars she had bought years earlier for hiking but rarely used. When 6:47 came and went with no sign of the man, she felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Maybe it had just been a coincidence. Maybe whoever it was had found whatever they were looking for or simply moved on. But at 6:52, he appeared, and this time Sarah was ready. Through the binoculars, she could see him much more clearly, and what she saw made her hands start to shake. The man appeared to be middle-aged, with pale skin and dark hair that hung limp around his face. His eyes were fixed on her building, and even from 4 floors up and across the street, Sarah was certain he was looking directly at her apartment window. But it was his mouth that made her step back from the window, nearly dropping the binoculars. He was smiling, a wide, unnatural smile that seemed to stretch too far across his face, and his lips were moving slightly, as if he were speaking to someone. Though there was no one else around, Sarah grabbed her phone and called the non-emergency police line, her voice shaky as she explained to the dispatcher that someone had been standing outside her building for several days, watching her apartment. The dispatcher was polite but clearly unimpressed, explaining that standing on a public street wasn't illegal, and that unless the person made contact with her or threatened her in some way, there wasn't much they could do. She suggested that Sarah document the incidents and call back if the behavior escalated. When Sarah looked out the window again, the man was gone, but this time she noticed something that made her blood run cold. There, pressed against the trunk of the oak tree, directly below her window, was a small piece of paper. Even from 4 floors up, she could see that it was white against the dark bark, and she knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't been there before. Asterisk, the elevator in Sarah's building had been broken for 2 weeks, so she took the stairs, her heart pounding as she descended to the ground floor. The lobby was empty except for the security guard, Marcus, who was watching something on his phone behind the front desk. Sarah had spoken to him a few times before, usually just pleasantries, about the weather or the broken elevator. He was in his 60s, a retired mechanic who had taken the security job to supplement his pension. Outside, the November air was sharp and carried the scent of wet leaves and car exhaust. The piece of paper was exactly where Sarah had seen it. From her window, folded once and wedged into a crack in the bark about 5 feet off the ground. Her hands were trembling as she pulled it free and unfolded it. Written in careful block letters with what looked like blacker were 4 words: "I know your schedule." Sarah looked around the empty street, suddenly aware of how isolated she felt despite being surrounded by apartment buildings filled with people. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light that seemed to make the darkness between them even deeper, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding someone. She hurried back inside, clutching the note, and found Marcus still at his desk. When she showed him the note and explained about the man who had been standing across the street, Marcus's casual demeanor shifted to something more serious. He was a large man with graying hair and kind eyes, and Sarah could see genuine concern in his expression as he examined the paper. He told her he would review the security footage from the past few days and see if he could spot anyone suspicious. The building had cameras covering the entrances and the parking garage, and while they didn't have a direct view of the street, they might have captured someone coming or going. He also gave Sarah his cell phone number and told her to call him immediately if she saw the man again or found any more notes. That night, Sarah barely slept. Every sound in the hallway made her freeze, listening for footsteps that might stop outside her door. She had checked and double-checked that her door was locked, and she had pulled the curtains closed across her living room window, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching. Around 3 a.m., she heard what sounded like someone walking slowly up and down the hallway outside her apartment, but when she looked through the peephole, she saw nothing but empty corridor lit by fluorescent lights. Saturday morning brought weak sunlight and the illusion of normalcy. Sarah made coffee and tried to convince herself that she was overreacting, that the note could have been meant for someone else, or could have been some kind of prank. But when she tentatively pulled back the curtains to look outside, her heart sank. There, in the exact same spot where he had stood every evening, was the man. In broad daylight, without the hood, Sarah could see him more clearly than she wanted to. He appeared to be in his 40s, with thin brown hair and skin so pale it was almost gray. He was wearing the same dark jacket, and even though it was nearly noon, he stood with the same unnatural stillness that had first caught her attention. This time, Sarah was certain he was looking up at her window, and when their eyes met across the distance, his smile widened into something that made her stumble backward. She grabbed her phone and called Marcus, who answered on the second ring and told her he would come up to take a look. While she waited, Sarah positioned herself where she could see the street without being clearly visible from outside, and watched as the man continued his vigil. He didn't move, didn't check his phone, didn't show any of the small movements and adjustments that normal people make when standing still for long periods. He simply stood there, smiling up at her building dot when Marcus arrived. Sarah let him into her apartment and led him to the window. She expected to have to point the man out, to explain what had been happening, but Marcus spotted him immediately, and his reaction was not what Sarah had hoped for. Instead of concern or anger, Marcus looked confused, and when Sarah asked him what he thought, his response chilled her. Marcus told her he had reviewed 3 days of security footage and had not seen anyone matching the description of the man across the street. The cameras covered everyone who entered or left the building complex, and while Marcus couldn't account for every visitor or delivery person, he was certain that no one had been lingering around the property for the kind of extended periods Sarah was describing. He had also walked the perimeter of the building that morning and found no additional notes or signs that anyone had been watching the building dot as they stood at the window looking down at the man. Marcus asked Sarah to describe exactly what she was seeing. When she pointed to the figure under the streetlight and described his appearance, Marcus was quiet for a long moment before telling her that he didn't see anyone there. The street, he said, was empty except for a few parked cars and some leaves blowing in the wind. Sarah stared at Marcus, then back at the street where the man was clearly visible, still standing in his impossible stillness, still smiling up at them. She described his location again, his appearance, the way he was positioned directly under the streetlight next to the oak tree. Marcus followed her pointing finger and shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of concern and something that looked like pity. He suggested that Sarah might be under more stress than she realized, that the long hours at work and the isolation of living alone might be affecting her perception. He recommended that she talk to someone, maybe her doctor or a counselor, and assured her that he would continue to monitor the building's security. He was kind about it, gentle in the way people are when they're trying not to upset someone they believe is having a breakdown. But his kindness only made Sarah feel more alone. After Marcus left, Sarah stood at the window staring down at the pathetic man who continued to stand motionless under the streetlight. She took photos with her phone, but when she reviewed them, they showed only an empty street. She called her sister in San Francisco, trying to keep her voice casual as she asked about stress and whether it was possible to see things that weren't there. Her sister, always practical, suggested that Sarah take a long weekend, maybe visit some friends, get some perspective. But Sarah knew what she was seeing, and she knew it wasn't stress or exhaustion or loneliness. The man across the street was real. The note had been real, and the fact that no one else could see him only made the situation more terrifying, not less. She spent the rest of Saturday researching online, reading about hallucinations and delusions, but also about stalking and surveillance, and people who seemed to have the ability to avoid detection. What she found didn't reassure her. That evening, at exactly 6:47 p.m., the man took up his usual position. This time, Sarah was ready with a plan. She grabbed her keys and her phone and headed for the stairs, determined to confront whatever was happening. If the man was real, she would get close. Enough to take a clear photo and maybe even speak to him. If he wasn't real, if she was having some kind of breakdown, then she would get close enough to the empty space where she thought he was standing to prove to herself that she needed help. The lobby was empty when Sarah passed through, Marcus having ended his shift at 6 p.m. Outside, the November evening was cold and still, with the kind of clarity that made every sound seem amplified. Sarah's footsteps echoed off the buildings as she crossed the street, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. As she approached the spot where the man had been standing, she could see him more clearly than ever before. He was tall and thin, just as she had thought, with pale skin that seemed to have a grayish tint in the streetlight. His dark jacket was worn and slightly too large, hanging loosely on his frame, but it was his face that made Sarah stop walking. When she was still 20 feet away, the man's features were sharp and angular, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes that reflected the streetlight like an animal's. His mouth was stretched in that same wide smile, but up close Sarah could see that it wasn't a natural expression of happiness or even malice. It looked like someone who had learned to smile by watching others do it, but had never understood what a smile was supposed to convey. His lips were pale, almost colorless, and they moved constantly in tiny movements, as if he were whispering something too quiet to hear. When Sarah was about 10 feet away, the man's head turned toward her with a motion that was too smooth, too fluid, like he was moving through water instead of air. His eyes fixed on hers, and Sarah could see that they were completely black. No distinction between pupil and iris, just solid blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. When he spoke, his voice was soft and conversational, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee. He said her name, Sarah Chun, and then he recited her address, her apartment number, her license plate number, the name of the company where she worked. He told her what time she left for work each morning, what she had eaten for dinner the previous 3 nights, the name of her cat. He knew that she had called her sister the night before, knew what they had talked about, knew that she had been researching hallucinations and surveillance online. His voice never changed tone or volume, remaining calm and pleasant as he listed details of her life that no stranger should have known. Sarah found herself unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but stare into those black eyes. As the man continued talking, he told her that he had been watching her for much longer than just a few days, that he had been learning about her, studying her habits and routines and preferences. He said that he found her fascinating, that there was something special about her that drew his attention. He never stopped smiling as he spoke, and his lips continued their constant tiny movements even when he wasn't forming words. When he finished speaking, the man tilted his head slightly, waiting for Sarah to respond. But Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't think of anything to say in response to the impossibility of the situation. After a moment, the man's smile widened even further, stretching until it seemed like his face might split open, and he spoke one more time. He told Sarah that he would see her tomorrow, and the next day, and every day after that. He said that now that they had met properly, things would be different, more intimate. Then he turned and walked away, not hurrying, just moving with that same fluid motion until the darkness swallowed him. Sarah stood under the streetlight for a long time after he disappeared, shaking and trying to make sense of what had just happened. When she finally made it back to her apartment, she called the police again, this time reporting a direct threat. The dispatcher took her information and promised to send an officer to take a report, but when the police arrived an hour later, Sarah realized how her story must sound. A man who couldn't be captured on camera, who no one else could see, who seemed to know impossible details about her life. The officers were professional but clearly skeptical, and Sarah could see them exchanging glances as she tried to explain what had happened. Asterisk. They took her report and assured her they would patrol the area more frequently, but Sarah could tell. They thought she was experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. After they left, she sat in her living room with all the lights on, staring at the closed curtains and wondering if the man was still out there. Still watching, still smiling. His impossible smile. Over the next few days, Sarah's life began to unravel in small but significant ways. She found notes tucked into her mailbox, slipped under her apartment door, taped to her car windshield. Each one contained information that should have been private, details about her bank account, her medical records, conversations she had had with friends. The notes were always written in the same careful block letters, and they were always signed with a single initial. D. Sarah tried showing the notes to Marcus, to the police, to her sister during a video call, but somehow the notes always appeared blank to everyone else. When Sarah held up a piece of paper covered with black text, others saw only white paper. When she read the contents aloud, people looked at her with the kind of concerned expression reserved for someone who was clearly struggling with reality. At work, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate. She would stare at her computer screen, but see only those black eyes and that impossible smile. Her coworkers began to notice that she seemed distracted, jumpy, talking to herself. Her supervisor, a kind woman named Janet, who had always been supportive, called Sarah into her office to ask if everything was all right. Sarah tried to explain about the man, about the notes, about the feeling of being constantly watched, but she could see Janet's expression change from concern to alarm. Janet suggested that Sarah take some time off, maybe see a doctor, get some help dealing with whatever was going on. The suggestion was gentle but firm, and Sarah realized that her job, her livelihood, was now at risk because of something that no one else could see or understand. She agreed to take a week of personal leave, hoping that some distance from her normal routine might help her figure out how to deal with the situation. But the man, who Sarah had started thinking of as D, didn't respect her time off. If anything, his presence became more intrusive. He no longer limited himself to standing across the street in the evenings. Sarah would catch glimpses of him everywhere, in the parking garage of her building, standing among the trees in the pocket park, sitting in parked cars on her street. He was always motionless, always smiling, always watching. The notes became more frequent and more disturbing. Dee began describing Sarah's dreams, detailing nightmares she had had in conversations she had imagined having with him. He wrote about her fears, her insecurities, her private thoughts with an accuracy that suggested he had access, not just to her physical life, but to her mind. Sarah stopped sleeping in her bedroom and started camping on her living room couch. But even there she felt exposed, vulnerable, watched. One morning, Sarah woke up to find a note that hadn't been slipped under her door or left in her mailbox. It was sitting on her coffee table, right next to where she had been sleeping, written on a piece of paper she recognized as coming from her own notepad. The message was simple. "Thank you for letting me in. Sarah called the locksmith that day and had all her locks changed, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever D was, wherever he came from, physical barriers didn't seem to apply to him. She considered moving, running away to another city, but she suspected that wouldn't work either. D had found her somehow, had chosen her for reasons she didn't understand, and she doubted that distance would discourage him. As the days passed, Sarah began to notice changes in herself. She was losing weight, sleeping only in brief, restless intervals, jumping at every sound. Her reflection in mirrors looked hollow-eyed and pale, almost gray, And sometimes she caught herself moving her lips constantly in tiny motions, the way Dee did. She realized she was starting to smile more often, wide smiles that felt unnatural and wrong, and she had to consciously force her face into normal expressions. The worst part was the isolation. Sarah's friends stopped calling after she canceled plans too many times or tried to explain what was happening to her. Her sister grew increasingly worried and then increasingly distant as Sarah's behavior became more erratic. Even Marcus, who had initially been sympathetic, now avoided making eye contact when she tried to talk to him about security concerns. Sarah was alone with Dee, and she was beginning to understand that this had always been the plan. 2 weeks after their first conversation, Dee began speaking to Sarah directly, not just when she encountered him on the street, but constantly, his voice a whisper in her ear, even when she was alone in her apartment. He told her about his day, about the other people he watched, about the things he learned from studying human behavior. He described Sarah's life back to her in detail, but from his perspective, as if he were a scientist observing a fascinating specimen. Dee explained that he had been watching Sarah for months before she noticed him, learning her routines and preferences. He said that most people never detected his presence, that they went through their lives completely unaware that they were being observed. But Sarah was different, special, sensitive in a way that allowed her to perceive him. This sensitivity, he said, was why he had chosen her, why he had decided to make contact. Sarah tried ignoring the voice, tried listening to music or television, loudly enough to drown it out, but Dee's whispers always came through clearly. She tried leaving her apartment, going to coffee shops or bookstores or anywhere with other people, but Dee's presence followed her everywhere. Sometimes she would catch glimpses of him in reflective surfaces, standing behind her, always smiling. Other times she would feel his breath on her neck when she knew she was alone. The relationship, because that's what Dee called it, began to change Sarah in ways she didn't fully understand. She found herself anticipating his voice, listening for his observations about her day. When he was quiet for long periods, she felt anxious, abandoned, as if something important was missing. She began to see the world through his eyes, noticing details about other people's behavior that she had never paid attention to before. Dee talked constantly about the nature of observation, about the difference between being seen and being understood. He explained that most human interaction was superficial, that people presented versions of themselves that bore little resemblance to their true nature. But Dee saw everything, understood everything, accepted everything. He knew Sarah completely. He said, in a way that no other person ever could or would. Sarah started to find a strange comfort in this complete lack of privacy. With Dee, there was no need to pretend, no need to be polite or appropriate or normal. He already knew her worst thoughts, her most embarrassing moments, her deepest fears. There was a relief in being completely known, even if the knowledge came from someone who shouldn't exist, but the comfort came with a price. Sarah's connection to the rest of the world continued to deteriorate. She lost her job after failing to return from her leave of absence and missing several calls from her supervisor. Her lease was up for renewal, and she realized she had no idea how she would afford to stay in her apartment without income. Her sister stopped calling after Sarah tried to explain that she wasn't alone, that she had someone who understood her better than family ever could. Dee seemed pleased by Sarah's increasing isolation. He told her that other people had never really understood her anyway, that they had only tolerated her because social convention required it. He was different, he said. He had chosen her specifically, had dedicated himself to knowing her completely. He was the only relationship she would ever need. As winter deepened and Sarah's world shrank to just her apartment and Dee's constant presence, she began to understand what he was offering. Complete understanding in exchange for complete surrender. No more pretending to be normal. No more struggling to connect with people who couldn't see or hear or understand the most important thing in her life. Dee promised that if she stopped fighting, if she accepted what was happening, he would take care of everything. Sarah's last contact with the outside world came when her sister flew in from San Francisco, worried by weeks of missed calls and strange, rambling messages. When Sarah opened her apartment door, she saw her own shock reflected in her sister's eyes. Sarah looked like she had lost 30 pounds. Her skin had taken on that grayish tint she had first noticed in Dee, and her eyes had developed a hollow quality that made her sister take a step back. During the visit, Sarah tried to act normal, tried to have a regular conversation about regular things, but Dee's voice was a constant whisper in her ear, commenting on everything her sister said and did. He pointed out her sister's discomfort, her fear, the way she kept glancing toward the door as if planning an escape. He suggested that Sarah's sister had only come out of guilt, that she was already planning to leave and never come back. When Sarah's sister suggested that Sarah come back to San Francisco with her, that she see a doctor, maybe stay in a hospital for a while until she felt better, Dee's whisper became urgent. He reminded Sarah that doctors wouldn't understand, that they would try to take him away from her, that they would fill her with medications that would dull her sensitivity and leave her alone again. He promised that if she went with her sister, if she let other people interfere, she would lose the only connection she had ever had to someone who truly understood her. Sarah chose Dee. She told her sister that she was fine, that she had everything she needed, that she wanted to be left alone. She saw the pain and fear in her sister's eyes as she understood that Sarah was choosing whatever delusion she was living over family, over help, over any chance at recovery. But Sarah also saw the relief, the recognition that her sister was being given permission to stop trying, to stop feeling responsible for someone who refused to be helped. After her sister left, Sarah felt the last thread connecting her to the outside world snap. Dee was pleased, almost excited, his whispers taking on a tone of anticipation. He told Sarah that now they could really begin, that the preliminary phase of their relationship was over and something deeper could begin. He explained that Sarah's isolation, her willingness to choose him over everyone else, had prepared her for the next step. Dee began to describe a different way of existing, a way of being that went beyond the normal human experience. He said that Sarah's sensitivity, her ability to perceive him when others couldn't, was just the beginning of what was possible. If she continued to trust him, to let him guide her, she could develop abilities that would make her current problems seem insignificant. She could learn to see the world as he saw it, to understand things that remained hidden from ordinary people. The process, Dee explained, required Sarah to let go of her attachment to her ordinary life, her ordinary identity. She needed to stop thinking of herself as Sarah Chun, data analyst, sister, friend, tenant, citizen. Those were all just roles she had been playing, masks she had worn to fit into a world that had never really accepted her anyway. Her true self, her essential self, was something much more interesting and much more powerful. Sarah found herself drawn to this idea. Her old life had brought her little happiness and considerable pain. She had always felt like an outsider, always struggled to connect with other people in meaningful ways. The life Dee was offering promised understanding, purpose, a sense of belonging that she had never experienced. It required giving up everything she had been, but what she had been hadn't been particularly worth preserving. Over the following weeks, Sarah stopped eating regularly, stopped cleaning her apartment, stopped maintaining any of the routines that had previously structured her days. She spent most of her time sitting in her living room, listening to Dee's voice and learning to see the world through his perspective. He taught her to notice details that ordinary perception missed, to understand the hidden motivations behind people's actions, to see the connections between seemingly unrelated events. These lessons often involved watching other people, and Sarah discovered that from her apartment window, she could observe the residents of the surrounding buildings with remarkable clarity. She began to recognize patterns in their behavior, to predict their actions, to understand their relationships and conflicts and secrets. Dee encouraged this observation, praising Sarah's growing insights and suggesting that she was developing abilities that few humans possess. As Sarah's perception sharpened, her connection to her own body seemed to weaken. She rarely felt hungry or tired, and when she looked in mirrors, her reflection seemed somehow less solid, less present than it had before. Her skin had taken on the same grayish tint that Dee's had, and her eyes were developing that same quality of absorbing light rather than reflecting it. She began to smile more often, and the smile felt increasingly natural, though she suspected it looked as unsettling on her as it did on Dee. Explained that these changes were signs of progress, evidence that Sarah was successfully transitioning from her ordinary existence to something more sophisticated. He said that the grayish skin was a sign of enhanced perception, that the hollow eyes allowed for better observation, that the constant smile reflected a deeper understanding of human nature that most people never achieved. Sarah was becoming something new, something better, something that could see and understand things that remained hidden from ordinary consciousness. The transformation accelerated as winter moved towards spring. Sarah stopped paying rent, stopped answering her door when the building manager knocked, stopped responding to any attempts at contact from the outside world. She existed in a bubble of observation and understanding, guided by Dee's constant presence and increasingly sophisticated lessons about the nature of reality and perception. Dee began to show Sarah things that existed beyond normal human perception, realities that were layered beneath the surface of ordinary experience. He taught her to see the connections between all living things, the patterns that governed human behavior, the hidden structures that shaped events in ways that most people never suspected. Sarah learned to perceive time differently, to understand that past and present and future were all occurring simultaneously, that what people experienced as linear progression was just a limitation of ordinary consciousness. As Sarah's understanding expanded, her sense of individual identity began to dissolve. She stopped thinking of herself as a separate being and began to understand that she was part of something larger, something that included Dee and extended far beyond both of them. Her apartment became a kind of observation post, a place from which she could monitor and understand the activities of the people around her, without being constrained by the social obligations that had previously limited her perception. Spring came early to Millbrook Heights in 2025, and with it came new residents to the apartment complex. Sarah watched them arrive from her window, guided by Dee's insights about what to look for, what details revealed character and intention and potential. She learned to identify which new residents would thrive and which would struggle, which relationships would succeed and which would fail, which individuals possessed the kind of sensitivity that might allow them to perceive beyond ordinary reality. Seemed particularly interested in one new resident, a young man named David Kim, who moved into an apartment in the building directly across from Sarah's. David worked as a software engineer and lived alone, and there was something about his behavior that caught Dee's attention. David spent long hours at his computer, often working late into the night, and he had a habit of standing at his window, looking out at the street below with an intensity that suggested he was seeing more than just buildings and parked cars. Began to focus more of his attention on David, and Sarah found herself watching him as well, learning to see what made him different from the other residents. David had a quality of alertness, of awareness, that reminded Sarah of herself before she had learned to see the world through Dee's eyes. He seemed to be looking for something, waiting for something, sensitive to subtleties that most people missed. Entirely. One evening in April, Sarah watched David standing at his window, and she realized that he was looking directly at her apartment, not just glancing in her direction, but staring with the kind of focused attention that suggested he could see her clearly despite the distance and the darkness. Dee's whisper in her ear was excited, pleased, as he confirmed what Sarah had suspected. David could see them, could perceive what others missed, possessed the sensitivity that Dee was always looking for. Dee suggested that Sarah make contact with David, that she help guide him through the early stages of the process she had undergone. Sarah was hesitant at first, unsure about reaching out to someone else after so many months of isolation. But Dee assured her that David needed their help, that he was struggling with perceptions and experiences that he didn't understand. Sarah could be the bridge between David's ordinary world and the expanded reality that Dee could offer. Sarah began by leaving notes for David, slipping them under his apartment door late at night when the building was quiet. The notes were simple at first, just acknowledgments that she had seen him watching, that she understood he was seeing things others missed. David's response was immediate and intense, written messages left where Sarah could find them, expressing relief that someone else understood what was happening to him, gratitude that he wasn't alone in his experiences. The correspondence between Sarah and David developed quickly, evolving from simple notes to longer letters that explored the nature of perception and reality. Sarah shared what Dee had taught her about observation and understanding, about the hidden structures that governed human behavior. David wrote about his own experiences, his growing ability to see patterns and connections that remained invisible to others, his sense that reality was far more complex and layered than most people suspected. Dee was pleased with Sarah's mentoring of David, praising her ability to guide someone else through the early stages of expanded perception. He suggested that Sarah was ready for greater responsibilities, that her understanding had developed to the point where she could help others make the transition from ordinary consciousness to something more sophisticated. Sarah felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her old life, a sense that she was finally using her abilities for something meaningful. As spring moved towards summer, Sarah's correspondence with David deepened into something that resembled friendship, though it was conducted entirely through written messages and observed behaviors. They never spoke directly, never met face to face, but their exchange of ideas and insights created a connection that Sarah found intellectually and emotionally satisfying. David was intelligent and thoughtful, and his perspectives on the nature of reality often complemented and expanded Sarah's understanding. Dee encouraged the relationship, suggesting that Sarah and David together could accomplish things that neither could achieve alone. He began to describe projects they could undertake, observations they could make, understandings they could develop that would benefit not just themselves, but the broader network of sensitive individuals that Dee was always working to identify and guide. But as the relationship between Sarah and David developed, Sarah began to notice changes in Dee's behavior. His whispers became more urgent, more possessive, and he seemed less pleased with Sarah's growing independence. He began to criticize her correspondence with David, suggesting that she was revealing too much too quickly, that David wasn't ready for the deeper truths that Sarah had learned. Dee reminded Sarah that her primary relationship was with him, that her loyalty should be to him first and foremost. Sarah found herself caught between her connection to David, which felt natural and intellectually stimulating, and her dependence on Dee, which had become so complete that she could barely imagine existing without his guidance. Dee had been her constant companion for months, the only presence that had offered understanding and acceptance when the rest of the world had rejected her. But David represented something different, a peer relationship based on mutual exploration rather than the teacher-student dynamic that characterized her relationship with Dee. The tension came to a head in late June when Sarah received a message from David suggesting that they meet in person. He had been having dreams, he wrote, dreams in which a tall, thin figure with black eyes watched him from across the street. The figure in his dreams smiled constantly and moved with an unnatural fluidity, and David was beginning to see this same figure during his waking hours. He was frightened, he admitted, but also curious, and he wanted to know if Sarah had experienced anything similar. When Sarah read David's message, Dee's response was immediate and intense. His whisper became a hiss, filled with anger and something that sounded like fear. He told Sarah that David was not ready, that meeting in person would be dangerous for both of them, that the process of expanded perception had to be undertaken carefully and gradually. Dee insisted that Sarah ignore David's request, that she continue their correspondence, but avoid any direct contact. But Sarah was curious about David's experiences, and she was beginning to question some of Dee's restrictions. Why shouldn't she meet someone who was going through the same process she had undergone? Why was Dee so insistent that she remain isolated? For the first time in months, Sarah found herself disagreeing with Dee's guidance, and the feeling was both terrifying and liberating. That night, Sarah made a decision that she knew would anger Dee. She wrote a message to David agreeing to meet him, suggesting that they meet in the pocket park between their buildings at midnight. She left the message where David would find it, and then she waited for Dee's reaction. Dee was furious. His whispers became shouts. His presence in Sarah's mind became oppressive and painful. He told Sarah that she was making a terrible mistake, that she was risking everything they had built together, that David was not what he seemed. Dee warned that meeting David would expose Sarah to dangers she couldn't understand, that there were forces at work that were hostile to the kind of expanded consciousness that Dee had helped her develop. But for the first time since their relationship began, Sarah resisted Dee's pressure. She told him that she needed to meet David, that she needed to understand what was happening to someone else who had been chosen for the same process. Dee's anger was palpable, his presence in her mind becoming so overwhelming that Sarah felt like she might lose consciousness, but she held firm in her decision. At midnight, Sarah left her apartment for the first time in months. The hallways of her building seemed strange and unfamiliar, as if she were seeing them for the first time. The elevator was still broken, so she took the stairs, each step echoing in the silence. Outside, the summer air was warm and humid, filled with the scent of night-blooming flowers and the distant sound of traffic. David was already waiting in the pocket park, standing under the same streetlight where Dee had taken his nightly vigil so many months before. When Sarah saw him up close, she was struck by how much he resembled her own appearance from months earlier, before her transformation had begun. He was thin and pale, but with the pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors rather than the grayish tint that Sarah had developed. His eyes were bright and alert, scanning the darkness as if he expected to see something that others would miss. When David saw Sarah approaching, his expression was a mixture of relief and concern. Sarah realized that her appearance must be shocking to someone who hadn't witnessed her gradual transformation. Her skin had taken on that grayish quality, her eyes had developed their light-absorbing depth, and she moved with the same fluid motion that Dee had always displayed. She was smiling, she realized, that same wide, constant smile that had once terrified her when she saw it on Dee's face. David spoke first, his voice quiet but intense. He told Sarah that he had been watching her for weeks, trying to understand what had happened to her. He had seen her standing at her window, always motionless, always smiling, and he had recognized something of himself in her behavior. He said that he had been experiencing things that he couldn't explain to anyone else, things that made him question his sanity and his understanding of reality. Sarah listened to David's description of his experiences, and she recognized every detail. The figure watching from across the street, the notes that appeared in impossible places, the voice that whispered constant observations and insights. David was in the early stages of the same process that Sarah had undergone, and Dee was guiding him just as he had guided her. But as David spoke, Sarah began to understand something that Dee had never explained to her. David described other people he had noticed, other residents of the complex who exhibited the same strange behaviors that Sarah had developed. A woman in Building C who stood at her window for hours at a time, never moving, always smiling. A man in Building A who left his apartment only late at night, moving with that same fluid motion that Sarah had learned from D. David had counted at least 6 people in the surrounding buildings who showed signs of the same transformation that Sarah had undergone. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. She was not unique, not special, not the only person who had been chosen for Dee's attention. She was part of a collection, one of multiple individuals who had been isolated and transformed and absorbed into whatever Dee represented. The relationship she had thought was intimate and exclusive was actually just one of many identical relationships that Dee maintained simultaneously. Dee's presence in Sarah's mind became overwhelming as she processed this information. His whispers, becoming desperate and pleading. He tried to explain that each relationship was unique, that Sarah's connection to him was different from and more important than his connections to others. He insisted that the other transformed individuals were at different stages of development, that Sarah was his most advanced and most valued student. But Sarah could see the truth now, could understand the pattern that Dee had hidden from her. He was a collector, a gatherer of sensitive individuals who he isolated and transformed and absorbed into his expanding network. Each person believed they were special, believed they had been uniquely chosen, but they were all just additions to Dee's collection of observers and students. David could see the change in Sarah's expression, could sense her growing understanding of the situation. He asked her what she had learned, what she had discovered about the figure who had been watching them both. Sarah tried to explain, but the words came out wrong, distorted by Dee's presence in her mind and by the months of isolation that had changed her ability to communicate normally. As Sarah struggled to speak clearly, she became aware that they were no longer alone in the pocket park. The other transformed individuals that David had described were emerging from the buildings around them, moving with that same fluid motion that Sarah recognized from her own movement. They approached slowly, silently, their faces all bearing the same wide, constant smile that Sarah wore. Dee's presence in Sarah's mind became jubilant, triumphant. He had been planning this, she realized, had been using her correspondence with David to draw him into a meeting where the full scope of Dee's network could be revealed. David was not just another individual to be transformed. He was someone whose sensitivity made him a potential threat to the secrecy that protected Dee's activities. The meeting was not about helping David understand his experiences. It was about bringing him fully into Dee's control. David saw the approaching figures and understood immediately that he was in danger. He grabbed Sarah's arm, trying to pull her away from the park, but Sarah found that she couldn't move, couldn't resist the pull of Dee's will. She was connected to him too deeply, had surrendered too much of her individual identity to act independently. She could only watch as David realized that she was not going to help him, that she was part of whatever was closing in around him. The transformed individuals surrounded David, still moving slowly, still smiling, but their intent was clear. Reached for him with movements that were coordinated, as if they were all controlled by a single consciousness. David struggled, shouting for help, but the buildings around the park remained dark and silent. Either no one could hear him, or no one was willing to respond to cries for help in the middle of the night. Sarah watched as David was overwhelmed by the group, his struggles becoming weaker as more hands grasped him. She wanted to help, wanted to break free from Dee's control and intervene, but she found that her own will had become so subordinated to Dee's that independent action was impossible. She could only observe as David's expression changed from fear to confusion to a strange kind of acceptance, as if Dee's influence was already beginning to work on him. The group carried David away from the park, moving toward one of the apartment buildings with their characteristic fluid motion. Sarah followed, unable to resist the pull of the collective will that now included her completely. She understood that David would be taken to an apartment where he would begin the same process of isolation and transformation that she had undergone. Guided by Dee's whispers and gradually separated from his Avazvai, connection to the ordinary world. As they moved through the quiet streets, Sarah became fully aware of the scope of Dee's network. The transformed individuals were not just isolated hermits living alone in their apartments. They were part of an organized system, a collective consciousness that operated under Dee's guidance. They watched and observed and reported, gathering information about the residents of the complex, identifying individuals who showed sensitivity to perceptions beyond normal human awareness. Dee's presence in Sarah's mind was satisfied, pleased with the successful addition of David to his collection. He explained to Sarah that her role in the process had been crucial, that her ability to gain David's trust and lure him into the meeting had demonstrated her value to the network. Sarah was no longer just an observer, Dee told her. She was now a recruiter, someone who could identify and attract other sensitive individuals. The apartment where they took David was identical to dozens of others in the complex, but it had been prepared for his arrival. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, the rooms were furnished with only the basic necessities, and the walls were lined with notebooks filled with observations about the building's residents. It was a perfect environment for the kind of isolation and focused observation that would begin David's transformation. Sarah watched as David was placed in a chair facing the covered window, his hands positioned so that he could write, but could not easily leave his seat. The other transformed individuals arranged themselves around the room, maintaining constant observation, their presence a physical manifestation of Dee's will. David's expression was blank now, his eyes taking on the same light-absorbing quality that Sarah recognized from her own reflection. Dee's voice filled the room, not just in Sarah's mind but audible to everyone present, though Sarah understood that only the transformed individuals could hear him. He welcomed David to the network, explained that David's sensitivity had marked him as someone capable of perceiving beyond ordinary human limitations. Dee promised that David would learn to understand reality in ways that most people never could, that he would become part of something larger and more important than his individual existence. Sarah listened to Dee's orientation speech and remembered her own early days, the sense of wonder and terror as her perception expanded and her connection to the ordinary world dissolved. But now she could see the process from the outside, could understand how calculated and manipulative it was. Dee was not offering expanded consciousness, he was harvesting consciousness, absorbing individual awareness into his own expanding network of observers and students. Over the following weeks, Sarah watched David undergo the same transformation she had experienced. He stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining normal hygiene, stopped responding to contact from the outside world. His skin took on the grayish tint, his eyes developed their light-absorbing depth, his mouth settled into that constant, unnatural smile. He spent his days writing observations about the people he could see from his window, guided by Dee's whispers and the presence of the other transformed individuals. But Sarah also began to notice something that Dee had not expected. Her awareness of the network, her understanding of the scope of his activities, had awakened something in her that Dee could not fully control. She began to retain some sense of individual identity, separate from the collective consciousness, some ability to observe and think independently of Dee's guidance. Sarah realized that Dee's control was not absolute, that it depended on isolation and ignorance. The transformed individuals could only be fully absorbed into the network if they believed they were unique, if they thought their relationship with Dee was exclusive and special. Knowledge of the network's true scope created resistance, allowed for the possibility of independent thought and action. Sarah began to test the limits of her independence, making small choices that contradicted Dee's guidance. She would look away from the window when Dee wanted her to observe, would think about her old life when Dee wanted her focused on the present, would remember her individual identity when Dee wanted her absorbed into the collective. Each act of resistance was small, almost imperceptible, but Sarah could feel her sense of individual will growing stronger. D noticed Sarah's resistance and began to pressure her more intensely, flooding her consciousness with reminders of how much he had done for her, how much better her life was now than it had been before. He threatened to withdraw his guidance, to leave her alone with the expanded perceptions that would be overwhelming without his help. But Sarah had learned that Dee needed her as much as she needed him, that the network depended on having recruiting agents who could attract new sensitive individuals. As summer moved toward fall, Sarah began to develop a plan. She could not escape Dee's influence directly, could not simply walk away from the network and return to her old life. But she could work to limit the network's growth, could try to protect other sensitive individuals from being drawn into Dee's web. She began to identify residents of the complex who showed signs of sensitivity, and instead of reporting them to Dee as she was supposed to do, she started warning them. Sarah's warnings were necessarily subtle and indirect. She could not approach potential targets directly without alerting Dee to her intentions. Instead, she left anonymous notes warning about surveillance, about people who watched from windows, about the importance of maintaining connections to family and friends. The notes were vague enough that most people would dismiss them, but specific enough that truly sensitive individuals would recognize the danger they described. Some of Sarah's warnings were effective. She watched as several residents who had shown signs of sensitivity suddenly became more cautious, more social, more connected to the outside world. They started closing their curtains at night, started spending less time alone, started maintaining regular contact with friends and family. Dee was frustrated by his inability to establish contact with these individuals, but he could not identify the source of their sudden wariness. But Sarah's resistance did not go unnoticed by the other members of the network. They began to watch her more closely, to report her unusual behaviors to Dee. Sarah realized that her position was becoming precarious, that Dee was beginning to suspect that she was working against the network's interests. The confrontation came. In October, when Dee gathered all the transformed individuals in David's apartment for what he called a coordination meeting, Sarah found herself surrounded by perhaps 20 people, all bearing the same grayish skin and hollow eyes and constant smile that had become her own identifying characteristics. They moved and spoke with the coordinated precision that indicated complete absorption into Dee's collective consciousness. Dee's presence filled the room with an intensity that Sarah had never experienced before. His voice came from every throat simultaneously, creating a chorus that was both hypnotic and terrifying. He spoke about the importance of unity within the network, about the danger posed by individual resistance to collective goals. He explained that the network could only function if all members were completely committed to Dee's vision, completely surrendered to his guidance. Dee then focused his attention specifically on Sarah, his voice becoming personal and intimate despite coming from 20 mouths at once. He thanked Sarah for her service to the network, for her success in recruiting David and her months of faithful observation and reporting. But he also expressed concern about her recent behavior, her tendency toward independent thought and action that threatened the harmony of the collective. Sarah felt the weight of 20 pairs of hollow eyes focused on her, felt Dee's presence pressing against her consciousness with overwhelming force. She understood that she was being given an ultimatum, a choice between complete surrender to the network and consequences that Dee did not need to specify. Looking around the room at the transformed individuals, Sarah could see what complete surrender looked like, could understand what she would become if she stopped resisting Dee's control. But Sarah also understood something that Dee had not expected her to learn. The network was not as stable as it appeared, not as unified as Dee claimed. The transformed individuals were not completely absorbed into the collective consciousness. They retained some spark of individual identity, some capacity for independent thought that Dee had to constantly suppress through his overwhelming presence. Sarah's resistance had awakened similar resistance in others, created small fissures in Dee's control, that could potentially be exploited. Sarah made her choice in that moment, though she did not announce it to Dee or to the other members of the network. She would continue to appear compliant, continue to perform her assigned role as observer and recruiter, but she would work systematically to undermine the network from within. She would use her knowledge of Dee's methods and goals to protect potential victims and to strengthen the resistance that she could see growing among the transformed individuals. Dee accepted Sarah's apparent surrender, satisfied that his display of power had restored her obedience. The meeting ended with renewed assignments for all network members, expanded surveillance responsibilities, and identification of new potential recruits. Sarah accepted her assignments without protest, already planning how she could subvert them. Without detection, over the following months, Sarah developed a careful strategy of subtle sabotage. She continued to identify sensitive individuals as Dee required, but she also warned them through anonymous communications. She maintained her surveillance assignments, but she began to include false information in her reports, describing normal behavior as suspicious and suspicious behavior as normal. She appeared to participate fully in the network's activities, while systematically working to reduce its effectiveness. Sarah's sabotage had to be extremely careful and gradual. Dee's control over the network was maintained through constant observation and communication, and any obvious resistance would be detected immediately. But Sarah had learned to think in ways that Dee could not easily monitor, to maintain private thoughts and intentions that remained hidden beneath her apparent compliance. The network began to experience problems that Dee could not easily explain. Potential recruits proved more resistant than expected, surveillance operations failed to produce useful information, and several transformed individuals began to show signs of independent thinking that required increased supervision. Dee responded by intensifying his control, increasing the frequency of coordination, meetings, and demanding more detailed reports from all network members. But intensified control created additional stress on the network, making Dee's influence more obvious and more oppressive. The transformed individuals began to experience their absorption into the collective consciousness as imprisonment rather than enlightenment, and some began to resist in small but significant ways. They would forget instructions, misinterpret assignments, or simply fail to respond to Dee's guidance with their previous reliability. Sarah watched these developments with growing hope, understanding that the network was becoming unstable under the pressure of its own expansion. Dee had absorbed too many individuals too quickly, had tried to maintain control over too large a group, and the system was beginning to break down. Individual resistance was spreading, creating a cascade effect that Dee could not easily stop. The crisis came in the spring of 2026, when one of the transformed individuals, a woman named Elena who had been part of the network for almost 2 years, simply walked away. She left her apartment, abandoned her surveillance assignments, and returned to her family in another state. Her departure was so sudden and complete that Dee had no opportunity to prevent it, no chance to reassert control before she was beyond his reach. Elena's escape proved that leaving the network was possible, that Dee's control was not absolute. More importantly, it demonstrated that the transformed individuals retained enough individual identity to make independent choices, even after months or years of apparent absorption into the collective consciousness. Elena's departure inspired others to begin planning their own escapes, creating an underground resistance movement within the network itself. Dee's response was swift and desperate. He increased surveillance of all network members, instituted mandatory daily check-ins, and began moving transformed individuals between different apartments to prevent them from developing unauthorized relationships. But these measures only increased the pressure on the network, making Dee's control more obvious and more oppressive, inspiring greater resistance. Sarah found herself at the center of the resistance movement, though she could not openly acknowledge her role. The other network members began to look to her for guidance and coordination, recognizing her as someone who had maintained more individual identity than most. Sarah used her position to help plan escapes, to share information about Dee's vulnerabilities, and to coordinate resistance activities across the network. The end came suddenly, in a cascade of departures that Dee could not prevent. Over the course of a single week in June 2026, more than half the network members disappeared, leaving their apartments and their assignments and returning to whatever remained of their lives outside Dee's influence. Some went home to families. Others simply disappeared into other cities and other identities, but all of them chose individual existence over collective absorption. Dee's presence in Sarah's mind became increasingly frantic as the network collapsed, his whispers becoming desperate. Pleas for loyalty and compliance. He promised Sarah greater responsibilities, exclusive relationships, anything that might convince her to remain. But Sarah had learned that Dee's promises were meaningless, that his apparent care and understanding were just tools for manipulation and control. On a warm evening in late June, Sarah made her final choice. She gathered what few possessions still mattered to her, wrote a letter to her sister explaining that she was alive and trying to recover, and walked out of her apartment. For the last time. Dee's voice followed her, screaming threats and promises alternately, but his influence weakened with each step she took away from the complex. Sarah drove through the night, putting as much distance as possible between herself and the place where Dee had controlled her life for more than a year. She understood that recovery would be difficult, that she would need to rebuild her identity and her connections to the ordinary world. The transformation she had undergone had changed her in ways that might be permanent, and she would always carry the memory of what it felt like to be completely absorbed into someone else's consciousness. But Sarah also carried something else, something that Dee had not expected her to develop during her time in the network. She had learned to recognize the signs of psychic predation, to identify individuals who possessed the kind of sensitivity that made them vulnerable to manipulation. She understood how isolation and desperation could be exploited, how the promise of understanding and acceptance could be used to trap people in relationships that destroyed their individual identity. Sarah decided to use this knowledge to help others, to work as an advocate for people who had experienced similar forms of psychological manipulation and control. She began volunteering with support groups, sharing her story with people who had survived abusive relationships, cults, and other forms of coercive control. She learned that Dee was not unique, that there were many predators who used similar methods to isolate and absorb vulnerable individuals. Over time, Sarah rebuilt her life on a foundation of genuine connection and mutual support. She maintained relationships with other survivors of the network, people who understood the unique challenges of recovering from that kind of systematic psychological control. Together, they worked to identify and help other victims, to raise awareness about the methods used by psychic predators, and to create support systems for people who were trying to rebuild their individual identity after experiencing collective absorption. Sarah never saw Dee again after leaving Millbrook Heights, but she sometimes heard reports from other survivors about sightings in different cities, different apartment complexes, different communities of isolated and vulnerable people. Dee's methods were consistent, his targets predictable, his promises always the same. But Sarah and the other survivors had created a network of their own, a network based on mutual aid rather than domination, on individual empowerment rather than collective absorption. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking. Not everyone who encountered Dee could be warned in time. Not everyone who was absorbed into his network could be reached before it was too late. But Sarah and her fellow survivors continued their efforts, understanding that each person they helped was a victory against the kind of predation that had once controlled their own lives. Years passed, and Sarah's life settled into a routine that was both ordinary and meaningful. She worked as a counselor specializing in recovery from psychological manipulation, maintained close relationships with friends and family, and lived in a small house with a garden that she tended carefully. The grayish tint had faded from her skin, the hollow quality had left her eyes, and she had learned to smile naturally again. Expressions of genuine happiness rather than the artificial display that Dee had imposed on her. But Sarah never forgot the lessons she had learned during her time in the network. She remained vigilant for signs of isolation and manipulation in the people around her, ready to offer help to anyone who showed signs of being targeted by predators like Dee. She understood that the promise of complete understanding and acceptance would always be attractive to people who felt disconnected from the ordinary world, and she worked to create genuine alternatives to the false solutions offered by those who would exploit that. Loneliness. Sarah's story became part of a larger narrative about survival and recovery, about the possibility of reclaiming individual identity after experiencing systematic control. She spoke at conferences, contributed to research about coercive relationships, and mentored other survivors who were working to rebuild their lives. Her experience with Dee had been traumatic and destructive, but it had also taught her about resilience, about the power of individual choice, and about the importance of genuine human connection. The apartment complex in Millbrook Heights still housed young professionals who worked downtown and drove electric cars and ordered their groceries online. But the surveillance network was gone, its members scattered to other lives and other identities. New residents moved into the vacant apartments, unaware of what had happened there, protected by their ignorance from the knowledge that such places existed in the ordinary world. Sometimes Sarah wondered if Dee had found new hunting grounds, new communities of isolated and vulnerable people to exploit. She suspected that he had, that his kind of predation was ongoing and would continue as long as there were people who felt disconnected from the world around them. But she also knew that there were networks of survivors working to identify and stop such predators, people who had learned from their own experiences and were committed to protecting others. The work continued, the vigilance continued, and the ordinary world went on, mostly unaware of the battles being fought for individual identity and psychological freedom. Sarah had found her place in that work, her purpose in that ongoing struggle, her meaning in the simple act of helping other people reclaim their right to exist as themselves rather than as extensions of someone else's will. And in the quiet moments, in her garden or in her home, or in the company of friends who knew her story and accepted her completely, Sarah experienced the thing that Dee had promised but never delivered, the thing that could only exist in relationships based on mutual respect and genuine care. She was truly seen, truly understood, truly accepted, not as part of a collective consciousness, but as an individual human being with her own thoughts and feelings and choices. The promise of complete understanding would always be seductive, Sarah knew, especially for people who felt isolated and disconnected from the world around them. But she had learned that genuine understanding could only exist in relationships that preserved and celebrated individual identity, relationships that enhanced rather than absorbed the people within them. That was the lesson she carried forward from her experience with Dee, the knowledge that guided her work and shaped her life. The darkness that had once seemed so appealing, so welcoming, had revealed itself to be a trap disguised as sanctuary. But Sarah had found her way back to the light, not the harsh fluorescent glare that exposed every flaw and imperfection, but the warm, gentle illumination that came from being genuinely known and accepted by people who chose to love her individual humanity rather than absorb it into something larger and more controlling. And so Sarah's story ended not with destruction, but with recovery. Not with absorption, but with the hard-won restoration of individual identity. Not with the false promise of complete understanding, but with the real experience of being truly seen and accepted as herself. The horror she had experienced was real, the trauma was lasting, but the human capacity for healing and connection had proven stronger than the forces that sought to destroy individual consciousness. That capacity for healing, for connection, for the preservation of individual identity in the face of systematic control was perhaps the most important lesson Sarah had learned. It was a lesson she shared with other survivors, with people who were struggling to recover their sense of self after experiencing manipulation and control. It was a lesson that offered hope to anyone who had ever felt lost, absorbed, controlled, or diminished by relationships or experiences that demanded the surrender of individual identity. The ordinary world continued around Sarah, filled with people living their individual lives, making their individual choices, maintaining their connections to family and friends and community. Most of them would never encounter the kind of systematic predation that Sarah had experienced, would never face the choice between individual identity and collective absorption. But for those who did face that choice, there were survivors like Sarah who understood what they were experiencing and who could offer genuine help and support. And that, Sarah understood, was the real victory over predators like Dee, not just individual escape, but the creation of networks of support and understanding that could help others recognize and resist manipulation. The transformation of trauma into wisdom, of victimization into advocacy, of isolation into community. The choice, again and again, to preserve and celebrate individual human identity against all the forces that would seek to diminish or control it. Asterisk. The night was quiet around Sarah as she finished her story, as she offered it to whoever was listening, wherever they were, whatever time it was in their location. The story was fiction, but the lessons were real. The warnings were genuine. The hope for recovery and connection was based on truth. And if someone listening recognized themselves in Sarah's experience, if someone understood the seductive danger of relationships that promised complete understanding at the cost of individual identity, then the story had served its purpose that the choice between individual existence and collective absorption was always available, always present, always requiring vigilance and courage. But the capacity for genuine human connection, for relationships that enhanced rather than diminished individual identity, was equally present, equally powerful, equally worthy of protection and cultivation. That was the message Sarah carried forward from her experience, the knowledge that guided her work and shaped her life. The promise that even after the deepest trauma, the most systematic control, the most complete absorption, individual identity could be reclaimed, relationships could be rebuilt, and the simple act of choosing to exist as oneself could be its own form of resistance and victory. Asterisk. And so the story ended where all recovery stories must end. Not with the elimination of all danger or the guarantee of permanent safety, but with the restoration of choice, the rebuilding of connection, and the ongoing commitment to preserve and celebrate the irreplaceable value of individual human consciousness. The darkness was real, the danger was ongoing, but the light of individual identity, carefully tended and fiercely protected, continued to shine. The call came in at 6:37 a.m. Margaret Whitmore, a retired librarian known for her punctuality and morning river walks, had failed to return home. Her husband Robert had waited until dawn before calling the police, explaining that Margaret never, ever deviated from her routine. Every morning at 5:15, she would kiss his forehead, slip into her walking shoes, and head down to the river path that wound through Millbrook's historic district. Detective Chun arrived at the Whitmore house to find Robert sitting at his kitchen table, still in his pajamas, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The man was 73 years old, married to Margaret for 48 years, and had never spent a night without knowing exactly where his wife was. Margaret's routine was as precise as clockwork. She would walk the same 3-mile loop every morning, stopping at the same bench overlooking the river's bend to watch the sunrise, then return home by 6:15 to prepare breakfast. The couple had been following this schedule for the past decade, ever since Robert's retirement. It was their shared ritual, their way of greeting each day together. Chun began her investigation by walking Margaret's usual route. The path was well maintained, with regular streetlights and emergency call boxes every quarter mile. Security cameras from the nearby shops and the old Riverside Inn captured portions of the walkway. The detective spent the morning reviewing footage, and what she found was both reassuring and disturbing. Margaret appeared on camera at 5:23 a.m., walking with her usual brisk pace, wearing her familiar red windbreaker and white tennis shoes. She passed the hardware store, waved to the owner who was setting up his morning display, and continued toward the river. The next camera, positioned near the old stone bridge, showed her crossing at 5:31 a.m., right on schedule. Then, nothing. The camera at the river bend, positioned to capture the scenic overlook where Margaret always paused for the sunrise, showed only empty benches and flowing water. Margaret Whitmore had simply vanished somewhere between the bridge and her favorite spot, a distance of less than 200 yards. Chun walked that stretch of path repeatedly throughout the day. There were no side trails, no places where someone could easily leave the main walkway without being noticed. On one side was the river, flowing deep and steady. On the other was a steep embankment leading up to Millbrook's main street, covered in thick brush and topped with a wrought iron fence. The detective expanded her search, bringing in officers to comb through the riverside vegetation and sending divers into the Clearwater River. They found nothing, no signs of struggle, no disturbed earth, no personal belongings. It was as if Margaret had simply ceased to exist during those 8 minutes between camera views. The investigation took on an increasingly surreal quality as the days passed. Chun interviewed everyone who might have seen Margaret that morning. The hardware store owner confirmed he had seen her wave, noting that she seemed perfectly normal, even cheerful. A jogger who regularly ran the path in the opposite direction remembered passing an older woman in red, but couldn't recall anything unusual about the encounter. Most puzzling were the findings from Margaret's phone. The device was equipped with GPS tracking, something her daughter had insisted upon after a previous health scare. The GPS showed Margaret's location progressing normally along her walking route until 5:34 a.m., when the signal simply stopped transmitting. Not lost or moved to an area without coverage stopped, as if the phone had been deliberately powered down or destroyed. Chun delved deeper into Margaret's life, searching for any detail that might explain her disappearance. What she discovered was a woman whose existence was remarkable in its ordinariness. Margaret had worked at the Millbrook Public Library for 32 years, retiring with commendations from the city council and a celebration attended by half the town. She volunteered at the local animal shelter, maintained a small garden behind her house, and had never missed a Sunday service at St. Mary's Episcopal Church. The detective interviewed Margaret's friends, fellow volunteers, and former colleagues. Everyone described the same woman: kind, reliable, perhaps a bit reserved, but genuinely loved by all who knew her. There were no secrets, no hidden debts, no estranged family members or bitter enemies. Margaret Whitmore was, by all accounts, exactly who she appeared to be: a devoted wife, caring friend, and pillar of her small community. As March turned into April, Chun found herself walking Margaret's route every morning, hoping to spot something she had missed, some clue that would break the case wide open. She began to understand why Robert Whitmore sat at his kitchen table each dawn, staring out the window toward the river path, waiting for a red windbreaker that would never again appear. The strangest development came 3 weeks after Margaret's disappearance. Chun was reviewing the case files in her office when her phone rang. The caller ID showed the Whitmore home number. Detective Chun? The voice was Margaret's, clear and unmistakable, though the connection was filled with static. Margaret? Margaret, where are you? Are you safe? I'm sorry, Sarah. I can't come home. Tell Robert I love him. Tell him I'm not suffering. The line went dead. Chun immediately contacted the phone company, but they had no record of any outgoing call from the Whitmore house during that time. Robert had been at his doctor's appointment across town, and the house had been empty. The phone company's records showed no unusual activity on the Whitmore line for the entire day. When Chun played the recording for Robert, he broke down completely. "That's her voice," he whispered. "That's my Margaret, but it's impossible." The detective spent days trying to trace the call, working with telephone company technicians and even consulting with federal agents who specialized in communication fraud. Every expert reached the same conclusion. According to their systems, the call had never happened. Yet Chun had the recording, clear and undeniable evidence of Margaret's voice. Summer arrived in Millbrook with its usual parade of tourists and seasonal residents. The Margaret Whitmore case remained open but had faded from daily conversation. New cases demanded Chun's attention: a string of break-ins at summer cottages, a suspected arson at the old textile mill, the usual problems that came with warm weather and increased activity. But Robert Whitmore never stopped his vigil. Each morning, he would walk Margaret's route, stopping at every spot she had loved, speaking to her as if she might somehow hear him across whatever vast distance now separated them. Chun often encountered him during her own investigative walks, and they would nod to each other in silent understanding, two people bound together by a mystery that refused to yield its secrets. The case took its final, most disturbing turn on a foggy morning in late September. Chun was reviewing cold case files when Officer Martinez burst into her office, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Detective, you need to see this, now." They drove to the river bend, where a small crowd had gathered around Margaret's favorite bench. There, carved into the wooden slats with what appeared to be a sharp knife, were 5 words in Margaret's distinctive handwriting: "I am watching the sunrise." Chun had seen Margaret's handwriting hundreds of times during the investigation. In Coca's handwritings hundreds of times during the investigation. Appointment books, grocery lists, letters to friends. There was no doubt that these words had been carved by Margaret Whitmore herself. But the wood around the carving showed signs of recent weathering, as if the message had been there for months, exposed to rain and sun and the passage of countless days. The detective called in specialists to examine the carving, hoping for some clue about when it had been made. The results were inconclusive but unsettling. The wood fibers suggested the carving was indeed months old, yet multiple witnesses, including Chun herself, had examined that bench countless times since March. The message had not been there before. As autumn deepened and the tourist season ended, Millbrook settled back into its quiet rhythms. But the town had changed. People walked the river path in groups now, and the early morning hours that Margaret had loved so much were largely abandoned. The mystery had infected the community like a slow poison, making everyone question what they thought they knew about their safe, predictable world. Chun continued her investigation with a determination that bordered on obsession. She had requested files on similar disappearances from neighboring counties, reaching out to detectives who might have encountered comparable cases. What she found was a troubling pattern that stretched back several years. In 2022, a man named David Rothschild had vanished while hiking a trail just 30 miles south of Millbrook. Like Margaret, he was a creature of routine, known for taking the same walk every weekend. Like Margaret, he had simply disappeared during a stretch of trail covered by security cameras, with no evidence of where he had gone. In 2023, Sarah Martinez, no relation to Officer Martinez, had disappeared while walking her dog in a park 2 counties over. Again, the same pattern: routine behavior, camera coverage that showed arrival but no departure, and no trace of what had happened during the gap. Chun began to see connections that made her question not just these individual cases, but the nature of disappearance itself. Each victim had been alone during their routine activities. Each had vanished in areas that should have provided no opportunity for concealment. And in each case, There had been subsequent contact, a phone call, a message, some sign that the missing person was aware of their loved ones, distressed but unable or unwilling to return. The detective's investigation had evolved beyond a simple missing person case into something that challenged her understanding of what was possible in the ordered world she thought she knew. But as winter approached and the first snow began to dust the empty river path, Chung remained committed to finding Margaret Whitmore, or at least to understanding what had happened to her on that March morning when she walked into the mist and never returned. The last entry in Chung's case file, dated December 31st, 2025, contained only a single line: Margaret Whitmore's disappearance remains under active investigation. The search continues. The museum night guard, moving from the riverside mists of Millbrook. Our next story takes us to the heart of Westfield, a mid-sized city known for its thriving arts district and the prestigious Caldwell Museum of Natural History. The museum, housed in a grand Victorian building that had once been the mansion of railroad baron Thomas Caldwell, attracted visitors from across the region with its impressive collection of fossils, minerals, and artifacts from ancient civilizations. Marcus Thompson had worked as the museum's night security guard for 7 years, a job that perfectly suited his temperament and personal circumstances. After a career in the military that had left him with chronic insomnia and a preference for solitude, the quiet halls of the Caldwell Museum provided exactly the kind of peaceful environment he needed. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week, Marcus was the sole guardian of millions of dollars worth of irreplaceable specimens and artifacts. The museum's security system was state-of-the-art, featuring motion detectors in every gallery, infrared cameras covering all entrances and exits, and a central monitoring station where Marcus could observe the entire building from multiple angles. His routine was simple but thorough. Hourly walks through all 3 floors, checking doors and windows, monitoring the climate control systems that kept the delicate specimens safe, and maintaining detailed logs of everything he observed. Detective James Fowler first heard about Marcus Thompson on the morning of August 23, 2025, when the museum's director, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, called the police department in a state of barely controlled panic. "Something terrible has happened," she said, her voice shaking. "Marcus didn't complete his shift last night, and we've discovered that several items are missing from the Egyptian collection." Fowler arrived at the museum to find a scene that immediately struck him as wrong in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Dr. Hartwell met him at the main entrance, explaining that she had arrived at 7 a.m. to find the building secure, but with no sign of Marcus. His car was still in the employee parking lot. His personal belongings were in the security office, and his logs showed regular entries until 2:15 a.m., when they simply stopped. The detective's first concern was for Marcus's safety. A preliminary search of the building revealed no signs of injury or struggle, but also no indication of where the night guard might have gone. The security footage presented an even more puzzling picture. The cameras showed Marcus conducting his normal routine throughout the early part of his shift. At 10:30 p.m., he appeared on the first-floor cameras, walking through the geology wing. At 11:30, he was visible in the second-floor anthropology section. At 12:30 a.m., the cameras captured him checking the third-floor paleontology gallery. But after 1:15 a.m., Marcus Thompson simply vanished from all camera feeds, despite the fact that motion detectors throughout the building continued to show periodic activity. Dr. Hartwell led Fowler to the Egyptian collection, housed in a climate-controlled room on the second floor. The missing items were small but valuable: a gold scarab beetle dating to the New Kingdom period, a painted limestone relief showing hieroglyphic text, and most significantly, a canopic jar lid carved in the shape of the falcon-headed god Horus. "These pieces are worth approximately $200,000, Dr. Hartwell explained. "But their historical value is incalculable. They're part of a collection that came to us from the Metropolitan Museum in New York. What struck Fowler as odd was the selective nature of the theft. The Egyptian room contained dozens of artifacts, many far more valuable than the missing pieces. A solid gold funeral mask, worth easily $500,000, sat untouched in its case just feet away from where the scarab had been displayed. The missing items seemed to have been chosen for reasons other than monetary value. The detective spent the remainder of the morning interviewing the museum staff. Marcus Thompson emerged from these conversations as a model employee, punctual, conscientious, well-liked by his colleagues despite his naturally quiet demeanor. He had no history of disciplinary problems, had never shown unusual interest in the museum's more valuable pieces, and was known to take his security responsibilities seriously. Dr. Sarah Kim, the museum's curator of ancient civilizations, provided additional context about the missing artifacts. Those particular pieces were part of a recent acquisition, she explained. They came to us just 6 months ago from a private collector who wished to remain anonymous. Marcus was actually present when we installed them in the display cases. Fowler's investigation took an unexpected turn when he learned more about the provenance of the stolen artifacts. The private collector who had donated them was eventually identified as Harrison Webb, a wealthy businessman who had made his fortune in technology before developing an obsession with ancient Egyptian culture. Webb had died in a car accident just 2 months before his collection was donated to the museum. The detective contacted Webb's estate attorney, hoping to learn more about the donated pieces. What he discovered raised troubling questions about the artifact's authenticity and legal ownership. According to the attorney, Harrison Webb had acquired his Egyptian collection through a network of dealers and auction houses over a period of 20 years. Some pieces had proper documentation tracing their ownership back decades, but others had more questionable histories. The 3 missing items, in particular, had been purchased from a dealer in Cairo who specialized in recently discovered artifacts. Mr. Webb always insisted his collection was legitimate, the attorney explained. But toward the end of his life, he became increasingly concerned about the ethical implications of his purchases. That's why he decided to donate everything to the museum. He wanted the pieces to be properly studied and displayed rather than hidden away in his private gallery. Fowler began to suspect that Marcus Thompson's disappearance and the theft might be connected to the artifact's disputed ownership. He expanded his investigation to include contacts Webb had made in Egypt, dealers who had sold pieces to the collector, and academic experts who had authenticated the donations. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Amira Hassan, an Egyptologist at the nearby university, contacted Fowler after reading about the theft in the local newspaper. Dr. Hassan had been consulted by Webb several years earlier to authenticate some of his acquisitions, including the 3 missing pieces. I advised Mr. Webb not to purchase those particular items, she told the detective. The documentation was suspect, and I believed they might have been looted from archaeological sites in Egypt. I recommended that he contact the Egyptian authorities to verify their legal status before completing the purchase. According to Dr. Hassan, Webb had ignored her advice and bought the artifacts anyway, but had later expressed regret about the decision. In their last conversation, just weeks before his death, Webb had mentioned his plan to donate his entire collection to the Caldwell Museum, specifically hoping that proper scholars would be able to determine which pieces should be returned to Egypt. The detective's investigation now focused on the possibility that Marcus Thompson had somehow learned about the questionable provenance of the artifacts and had taken them for reasons related to their disputed ownership. But this theory raised as many questions as it answered. How would a night security guard have learned about academic disputes over ancient artifacts? And why would he risk his job and his freedom over pieces that didn't belong to him? The answer came from Marcus's apartment, which Fowler searched with the help of the building's landlord. What the detective found there painted a completely different picture of the missing night guard. Marcus Thompson's small apartment was filled with books on ancient history, particularly Egyptian civilization. His shelves contained academic texts, archaeological journals, and detailed studies of museum ethics and cultural repatriation. Most surprising of all was a desk covered with correspondence between Marcus and various scholars, Egyptian cultural officials, and international organizations dedicated to returning looted artifacts to their countries of origin. The detective learned that Marcus had been quietly pursuing a degree in ancient history through online courses, using his night shift schedule to accommodate his studies. He had developed a particular interest in the ethical issues surrounding archaeological artifacts, writing papers on the responsibility of museums to verify the legal status of their collections. Most revealing was a series of emails between Marcus and Dr. Rashid Farouk, a representative of Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. The correspondence showed that Marcus had been working with Egyptian authorities to identify potentially looted artifacts in American museum collections, providing detailed photographs and descriptions of pieces he encountered during his security rounds. The final piece of the puzzle was found in Marcus's laptop computer. His browser history showed extensive research into the 3 missing artifacts, including academic papers that questioned their authenticity and legal ownership. Marcus had discovered the same concerns that Dr. Hassan had raised with Harrison Webb years earlier. But the most significant finding was a draft email, apparently written on the night Marcus disappeared, addressed to Dr. Farouk in Cairo. The message read, "I have verified that the 3 pieces we discussed are currently on display at the Caldwell Museum. I believe I have found a way to ensure their safe return to Egypt. If my plan succeeds, they will be in your hands within the week. If something happens to me, please know that I acted according to my conscience and my respect for your nation's cultural heritage." The email had never been sent. Fowler's investigation had revealed Marcus Thompson's likely motivation, but the night guard's fate remained a mystery. The museum's security cameras showed him disappearing from view just after 1 a.m., and despite extensive searches of the building and surrounding area, no trace of him had been found. The case took its strangest turn 3 days later when Dr. Farouk contacted the police department from Cairo. The Egyptian official explained that he had been working with Marcus Thompson for several months to identify artifacts that should be returned to Egypt. But more importantly, he had just received a package containing the 3 missing pieces from the Caldwell Museum. "The package was delivered to my office this morning," Dr. Farouk told Fowler during a lengthy international phone call. It contained the scarab, the limestone relief, and the canopic jar lid, along with documentation proving their origin from archaeological sites in Saqqara. There was also a letter explaining that these pieces were being returned to their rightful home. The letter was unsigned, but Dr. Farouk was certain it had been written by Marcus Thompson. The handwriting matched previous correspondence, and the letter contained details about the artifacts that only Marcus would have known. What baffled everyone involved was the logistics of the return. The package had been sent from a shipping office in New York City, but security cameras at the facility showed no one matching Marcus's description. The return address was false, and the payment had been made with cash by someone whose face was obscured by a baseball cap and surgical mask. Fowler expanded his search to New York, working with federal agents to trace Marcus's possible movements after his disappearance from the museum. But despite checking airline records, bus stations, and rental car agencies, no evidence could be found that Marcus Thompson had ever left Westfield. The investigation eventually concluded that Marcus had somehow managed to remove the artifacts from the museum and arrange for their return to Egypt, but his current whereabouts remained unknown. The case was classified as a theft with extenuating circumstances. The stolen property had been returned to what most experts agreed was its rightful owner, but a man was still missing. Dr. Hartwell made the decision to continue paying Marcus's salary into his bank account, hoping that he would eventually return to claim it. The museum also established a scholarship fund in his name for students studying museum ethics and cultural repatriation. Detective Fowler kept the case active on his desk, reviewing the files periodically and following up on any leads that might shed light on Marcus Thompson's fate. He had developed a grudging respect for the night guard's principles, even while struggling to understand how a man could simply vanish from a building equipped with some of the most sophisticated security systems available. The last entry in Fowler's case file, dated 6 months after Marcus's disappearance, contained a note that the detective never shared with his supervisors. Received anonymous tip that Marcus Thompson was spotted working as a security guard at a museum in Alexandria, Egypt. Cannot verify, but source seemed reliable. Sometimes justice takes unexpected forms. The photographer's final shot. Our journey through the shadows continues in the mountain town of Cedar Falls, where the crisp air and stunning natural beauty had attracted photographers from around the world for decades. Among these artists was Elena Rodriguez, a 34-year-old landscape photographer whose work had been featured in National Geographic, Outside Magazine, and gallery exhibitions across the country. Elena had moved to Cedar Falls 5 years earlier, drawn by the dramatic seasons and the way morning light played across the surrounding peaks. She had purchased a small cabin on the outskirts of town, converting the basement into a darkroom where she still developed her film using traditional methods. Despite the digital revolution in photography, Elena insisted that nothing could match the depth and richness of images captured on silver halide film. Detective Rachel Morrison had never heard of Elena Rodriguez until the morning of October 15, 2025, when the photographer's editor at Mountain Vista magazine called the Cedar Falls Police Department to report that Elena had missed a crucial deadline for the first time in their 5-year working relationship. Elena is obsessively punctual, explained Jennifer Walsh, the magazine's photo editor. She submits her work exactly when promised, sometimes days early, never late. When she didn't deliver the autumn series yesterday, I knew something was wrong. Morrison drove to Elena's cabin to conduct a welfare check, finding the property quiet and apparently secure. Elena's car was parked in its usual spot, and there were no obvious signs of disturbance. The detective knocked repeatedly on the front door and walked around the building, calling Elena's name, but received no response. The cabin's front door was unlocked, which immediately raised Morrison's concerns. Cedar Falls had a low crime rate, but most residents still secured their homes, especially those living alone in remote areas. The detective entered the cabin, announcing herself loudly and calling for Elena. What Morrison found inside painted a picture of a life interrupted in the middle of ordinary activities. A half-eaten breakfast sat on the kitchen table, the coffee still lukewarm to the touch. Elena's photography equipment was scattered around the living room as if she had been cleaning and organizing her gear. Most significantly, the basement darkroom showed signs of recent use. Chemicals in the development trays were still active, and strips of film hung from drying lines. The detective's attention was immediately drawn to a series of black and white photographs clipped to a line in the darkroom. The images appeared to be Elena's latest work, showing various locations around Cedar Falls during the peak autumn foliage season. The photographs were stunning, capturing the interplay of light and shadow across the mountainous landscape, with an artist's eye for composition and mood. But one photograph stood out from the others in a way that made Morrison deeply uncomfortable. The image showed the old Riverside Cemetery, located about 2 miles from Elena's cabin. The photograph had been taken during the golden hour just before sunset, when long shadows stretched across the weathered headstones and ancient oak trees created intricate patterns of light and dark dot at first glance. It was a beautiful, evocative image that captured the peaceful melancholy of the historic cemetery. But as Morrison studied the photograph more closely, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. Among the shadows cast by the headstones, There appeared to be a human figure, a dark silhouette that didn't correspond to any visible monument or tree. The detective photographed Elena's darkroom with her phone, paying special attention to the cemetery image, then searched the rest of the cabin for clues about where the photographer might have gone. Elena's bedroom showed no signs of packing or preparation for travel. Her purse was on the nightstand, containing credit cards, cash, and identification. Her cell phone was charging on the kitchen counter. Morrison expanded her search to the property surrounding the cabin. Elena owned 3 acres of heavily wooded land that bordered the national forest, providing numerous trails and scenic viewpoints that she used for her photography work. The detective spent hours walking these trails, calling Elena's name and looking for any signs of where she might have gone. The breakthrough came when Morrison returned to examine the photographs in Elena's darkroom more carefully. Using a magnifying glass that Elena kept for detailed print examination, the detective studied each image in the Autumn series. What she discovered made her immediately contact the state crime lab for assistance. Several of the photographs contained anomalies that were difficult to explain. In addition to the mysterious figure in the cemetery image, other photos showed shadowy shapes that didn't correspond to any visible objects in the landscape. A picture of the old covered bridge over Cedar Creek appeared to show someone standing beneath the structure, though the area should have been empty. An image of the town's historic district included what looked like a person watching from a second-story window of a building that had been vacant for years. The detective spent the next day visiting each location where Elena had taken photographs, trying to understand what she might have captured with her camera. The Riverside Cemetery was her first stop, and Morrison was immediately struck by how different the location felt in person compared to Elena's artistic interpretation. The cemetery dated back to the 1800s, when Cedar Falls had been a thriving logging community. Many of the headstones were weathered beyond legibility, and portions of the graveyard had been reclaimed by forest undergrowth. It was the kind of place that naturally evoked thoughts of mortality and the passage of time, exactly the sort of subject matter that would appeal to a photographer like Elena. Morrison walked through the cemetery, trying to determine where Elena had positioned her camera to capture the image that now hung in the darkroom. She found the likely spot near the cemetery's main gate, where Elena would have had a clear view of the headstones and oak trees that featured prominently in the photograph. But standing in that position, looking across the cemetery in the late afternoon light, Morrison could see nothing that would have created the mysterious shadow figure visible in Elena's photograph. She took several pictures with her phone from the same angle, but her digital images showed only empty spaces between the headstones. The detective's investigation expanded to include Elena's professional contacts and personal relationships. Jennifer Walsh at Mountain Vista magazine provided a list of Elena's recent assignments and mentioned that the photographer had been working on a personal project documenting abandoned locations around Cedar Falls. Elena was fascinated by places where history lingered, Walsh explained. She had this theory that certain locations retained emotional imprints of the people who had lived and worked there. She was always looking for ways to capture those feelings in her photographs. Morrison interviewed several local residents who had known Elena well. The photographer was described as talented but somewhat reclusive, preferring the company of her cameras to large social gatherings. She had been dating Tom Harrison, a local park ranger, for about 8 months. But even he admitted that Elena often disappeared for days at a time when working on photography projects. She was passionate about her art, Harrison told the detective. Sometimes she would get completely absorbed in a project and lose track of time. But she always checked in eventually, especially if she was working in remote areas. Harrison's concern had prompted him to visit Elena's cabin the day before the magazine editor had called the police. Finding no one home and assuming Elena was out photographing, he hadn't thought to contact authorities until Morrison interviewed him as part of her investigation. The detective's next step was to have Elena's photographs examined by experts at the State Crime Lab. She was particularly interested in understanding whether the mysterious figures visible in several images were photographic artifacts, double exposures, or evidence of people who had actually been present when the pictures were taken. The lab's analysis revealed that the photographs had not been manipulated or altered in any way. The images were straightforward silver gelatin prints developed using traditional darkroom techniques. But the shadowy figures visible in several photographs remained unexplained. They appeared to be genuine photographic captures of something that had been present in the scenes. But their nature remained unclear. Dr. Patricia Vance, a forensic photography expert consulted on the case, offered several possible explanations. These could be cases of pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar shapes in ambiguous visual information. They might also be photographic artifacts created by unusual lighting conditions or chemical inconsistencies in the development process. But I'll admit, some of these images are difficult to explain through conventional means. The investigation took a more ominous turn when Morrison discovered Elena's field notes, hidden in a drawer beneath other photography supplies. The notes revealed that Elena had been documenting what she called presence phenomena at various locations around Cedar Falls. According to her meticulously kept records, Elena had begun noticing unusual elements in her photographs about 6 months earlier. Initially, she had dismissed these as technical errors or tricks of light and shadow. But as the occurrences became more frequent and more distinct, she had started deliberately seeking out locations where she might capture these mysterious elements. The field notes included detailed descriptions of her experiences at each location. At the Riverside Cemetery, she had written, "Strong sense of being watched while setting up equipment. Photographed feeling of presence near old oak tree. Review of negatives confirms shadow figure not visible to naked eye. At the abandoned Millfield textile factory on the outskirts of town. Cold spots throughout building despite warm afternoon. Camera equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. Final shots show multiple figures in upper floor windows. Building should have been empty." At the historic Cedar Falls Hotel, which had been closed for renovation, heard voices from unoccupied rooms while photographing exterior. Security guard confirmed building was empty. Developed images show lights in windows of rooms without electrical power. The final entry in Elena's notes was dated October 13th, just 2 days before her disappearance. Planning final session at the old railroad tunnel tomorrow evening. Previous visits suggest strong activity at sunset. May have breakthrough. Documentation of presence phenomena. Will bring extra film and backup equipment. Morrison immediately drove to the abandoned railroad tunnel mentioned in Elena's notes. The tunnel had been carved through solid rock in the 1920s to allow trains to traverse the mountains more easily. When the rail line was rerouted in the 1970s, the tunnel had been sealed at both ends and forgotten by most residents of Cedar Falls. The detective found Elena's photography equipment positioned at the tunnel's sealed entrance tripod, camera, bag, and several rolls of exposed film. But there was no sign of Elena herself. Morrison carefully collected the equipment and film, hoping they might provide clues about what had happened to the photographer. Back at the police station, Morrison arranged for Elena's final rolls of film to be developed by a professional lab. The results were both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The photograph showed the tunnel entrance at various times throughout what appeared to be several hours of shooting. But as the sequence progressed, the images began to change in ways that challenged rational explanation. Early photographs showed the tunnel entrance as Morrison had seen it, concrete barriers sealing both ends, with weeds and small trees growing around the abandoned structure. But later images in the sequence showed the barriers becoming increasingly transparent, as if Elena's camera was somehow seeing through solid concrete to the dark tunnel interior beyond. The final photographs in The series were the most unsettling. They appeared to show figures moving within the tunnel, dark shapes that seemed to be walking toward the camera from deep within the abandoned passage. The last image on the roll showed what looked like a hand reaching toward the camera lens. From just inside the tunnel entrance, Morrison returned to the tunnel with a team of investigators, determined to understand what had happened to Elena Rodriguez. They used ground-penetrating radar to examine the sealed entrances, hoping to determine if the concrete barriers were actually solid or if there might be gaps that Elena could have slipped through. The radar results confirmed that both tunnel entrances were sealed with several feet of solid concrete. There was no way Elena could have entered the tunnel, and certainly no way that anyone could have been moving around inside the abandoned passage. Yet her photograph seemed to show exactly that. The investigation expanded to include structural engineers who examined the tunnel's construction records and spelunkers who explored other cave systems in the area, looking for connections that might explain Elena's photographs. But every expert consulted reached the same conclusion. The tunnel was completely sealed and had been for decades. As winter settled over Cedar Falls, Detective Morrison found herself no closer to understanding Elena Rodriguez's fate than she had been on the day the photographer was first reported missing. The case had evolved from a simple missing person investigation into something that challenged her understanding of reality itself. The detective kept Elena's final photographs in her case file, studying them regularly and showing them to various experts in photography, psychology, and physics. No one could provide a satisfactory explanation for what Elena's camera had captured during those final hours at the tunnel. The coastal town of Millbrook Harbor had always been a place where time seemed to move differently. Nestled along Maine's rugged shoreline, it was the kind of community where everyone knew their neighbors, where the local diners served the same menu for 30 years, and where the lighthouse that stood sentinel over the rocky coast had guided ships safely home for over a century. But in the early morning hours of March 15th, 2023, Detective Sarah Chun would discover that even the most peaceful places harbor their own dark secrets. The call came in at 4:47 a.m., just as the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the Atlantic horizon. Margaret Whitmore, the lighthouse keeper who had tended the beacon for nearly 2 decades, had failed to appear for her regular morning check-in at the harbormaster's office. This was unusual for Margaret, a woman whose routine was as predictable as the tides themselves. Every morning at 4:30 a.m. sharp, she would walk the quarter-mile path from the lighthouse to the harbor office, log her overnight observations, and share a cup of coffee with whoever was on duty. When Detective Chun arrived at the lighthouse, she found the heavy wooden door standing slightly ajar, creaking softly in the salt-tinged morning breeze. The lighthouse itself was a magnificent structure, painted in classic white with a red stripe spiraling up its length, standing 48 feet above the rocky promontory where waves crashed endlessly against ancient granite. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. Margaret's personal belongings were in their usual places, her bed was neatly made, and there were no signs of struggle or forced entry. But as Detective Chun climbed the narrow spiral staircase that wound its way to the lamp room at the top, she noticed something peculiar. The lighthouse beacon, which should have been automatically cycling through its programmed sequence of flashes, was dark and still. The massive Fresnel lens, worth more than most people's homes, sat silent in its housing, and the logbook where Margaret meticulously recorded weather conditions, ship sightings, and maintenance notes had an entry from the previous evening at 11:30 p.m. But nothing after that. The entry itself was cryptic. Fog rolling in from the northeast, visibility dropping rapidly, strange lights visible approximately 2 miles offshore. moving in patterns inconsistent with normal vessel traffic. Will continue to monitor. Below this, in what appeared to be Margaret's handwriting, but was noticeably more hurried and shaky than her usual careful script, were the words, "They're not boats. I need to document this properly. If something happens to me, check the hidden compartment behind the lamp housing." Detective Chon's training had taught her to be skeptical of dramatic statements, but something about the lighthouse keeper's disappearance felt different from the usual missing person cases. Margaret Whitmore was 73 years old, had no family in the area, and had never shown signs of mental instability or confusion. Her medical records, obtained later that day, showed her to be in excellent health for her age, with no history of dementia or other cognitive issues. The hidden compartment behind the lamp housing proved to be real. Concealed behind a panel that looked identical to the surrounding metal work, Detective Chen discovered a waterproof box containing dozens of photographs, detailed written observations, and what appeared to be carefully plotted charts of unusual maritime activity dating back over 15 years. The photographs were particularly intriguing, showing lights in various formations over the ocean at night, sometimes in perfect geometric patterns, other times moving in ways that seemed to defy conventional navigation. Margaret's notes revealed a methodical mind at work. She had documented dates, times, weather conditions, and had even attempted to correlate the appearances of these mysterious lights with tidal patterns, moon phases, and seasonal changes. Some entries described the lights as appearing to communicate with each other, flashing in sequences that seemed too organized to be random. Others noted that during these sightings, her radio equipment would experience significant interference, and on several occasions, compasses in the lighthouse would spin wildly without explanation. The most recent entries, from the weeks leading up to her disappearance, showed increasing concern. Margaret had noted that the lights were appearing more frequently and coming closer to shore. She had also documented several instances of her equipment malfunctioning in ways that seemed to coincide with these sightings. Most unsettling of all were her final few entries, which suggested she believed she was being watched. February 28th. Lights appeared again tonight, closer than ever before. I have the distinct feeling that they're aware of my observations. When I used my binoculars to get a better look, the entire formation seemed to pause and then move directly toward the lighthouse before suddenly vanishing. Found footprints in the sand below the lighthouse this morning, but they don't match any shoe I've ever seen. The impressions are too deep for a normal person, and the spacing between steps is longer than should be possible. Detective Chun's investigation expanded to include the Coast Guard, who confirmed that they had received no reports of unusual maritime activity in the area during the timeframe Margaret had documented. Local fishermen, when interviewed, provided conflicting accounts. Some dismissed Margaret as an eccentric old woman who had spent too many years alone with her imagination, while others quietly admitted they had seen strange things over the years, but preferred not to talk about them openly. One fisherman, Captain Henry Rodriguez, who had worked these waters for 40 years, eventually agreed to speak privately with Detective Chen. He described seeing lights beneath the water on several occasions, moving too quickly and too deliberately to be any known marine life or underwater vehicles. He also mentioned that his fish finder equipment would sometimes detect large, fast-moving objects in areas where the water was far too deep for any known sea life to survive. I never talked about it because people would think I was crazy, Rodriguez explained, his weathered hands gripping his coffee cup tightly. But Margaret wasn't crazy. She was the most observant person I ever knew. If she documented something, it happened. The question isn't whether she saw these things. It's what they were and what happened to her when she got too close to figuring it out. Asterisk, the official investigation continued for months, but Margaret Whitmore's disappearance remained unsolved. Her lighthouse was eventually automated, removing the need for a human keeper. and her personal effects were donated to the local historical society. But Detective Chun never forgot the case, and she kept Margaret's hidden documentation in a secure file, adding to it whenever reports of unusual maritime activity came across her desk. Local legends began to grow around the lighthouse, with some claiming that on foggy nights, you could still see Margaret's silhouette in the lamp room, continuing her vigilant watch over the mysterious waters she had observed for so many years. Whether these stories held any truth, or were simply the way small communities process inexplicable events, remained as mysterious as Margaret's disappearance itself. Dr. Elena Vasquez had always been the kind of professor who inspired fierce loyalty among her students and colleagues. As the head of the quantum physics department at Riverside University in Colorado, she was known for her groundbreaking research into parallel dimensional theory and her ability to explain complex scientific concepts with infectious enthusiasm. She was also known for her predictable routines and methodical approach to life, which is why her sudden disappearance on the evening of June 7, 2023, sent shockwaves through the academic community and baffled local authorities. Detective Marcus Webb had handled missing person cases before, but nothing quite like this. Dr. Vasquez had been working late in her laboratory, as she did most evenings, when the university's security cameras captured what would become one of the most puzzling pieces of evidence in the case. At 11:43 p.m., the cameras showed Dr. Vasquez alone in her lab, working at her computer and occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal she always carried. At 11:44 p.m., the cameras showed an empty lab. She had simply vanished without any visible means of exit. The laboratory itself was on the third floor of the physics building, with only one entrance and no windows large enough for a person to climb through. The hallway cameras, which covered the only exit route, showed no one leaving the lab during the time period in question. The windows were original to the 1960s building and had been painted shut for decades due to the building's updated climate control system. Even if someone had managed to open them, the drop to the ground below would have been fatal. What made the case even stranger was the state of Dr. Vasquez's work when authorities arrived. Her computer was still running, displaying a complex mathematical equation that none of her colleagues could immediately understand. Her journal was open to a page filled with calculations and what appeared to be dimensional coordinates, along with a hastily scrawled note: "The barrier is thinner than we thought." The equation suggests intersection points where parallel realities might overlap. If my calculations are correct, tonight's electromagnetic storm could create a temporary window. This is either the breakthrough we've been searching for, or the most dangerous mistake I'll ever make. The electromagnetic storm referenced in her notes had indeed occurred that night. The National Weather Service had recorded unusual atmospheric electromagnetic activity throughout the Colorado region, with several power grids experiencing temporary fluctuations. The university's own instruments had detected electromagnetic readings far beyond normal parameters, particularly in the area around the physics building. Dr. Vasquez's research, when examined by her colleagues, proved to be far more advanced than anyone had realized. She had been working on theoretical models that suggested the existence of thin spots in the fabric of reality, where parallel dimensions might briefly intersect. Her calculations indicated that under specific atmospheric conditions, combined with precise electromagnetic frequencies, these intersection points could potentially be detected and even accessed. Her graduate assistant, Thomas Park, provided crucial insight into Dr. Vasquez's state of mind in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. According to Park, she had become increasingly excited about her research, but also increasingly secretive. She had begun working alone on her most sensitive experiments and had started arriving at the lab at unusual hours to avoid interference from other researchers and their equipment. She kept talking about proving that parallel realities weren't just theoretical, Park told Detective Webb. She believed she was close to demonstrating that multiple versions of our universe exist simultaneously, and that under the right conditions, you could detect evidence of these other realities. The night she disappeared, she had asked me to monitor the electromagnetic readings from the weather station and call her if they reached a certain threshold. When I called her at 11:30 p.m. to report that the readings had spiked, she sounded more excited than I had ever heard her. The university's administration was cooperative, but clearly uncomfortable with the publicity surrounding the case. Missing professors were bad for enrollment and funding, particularly when the circumstances were as bizarre as these appeared to be. They provided access to Dr. Vasquez's research files, though many of her most recent calculations were stored in encrypted formats that took weeks for specialists to decode. When the encryption was finally broken, the revealed documents painted a picture of a brilliant scientist who believed she was on the verge of a discovery that would fundamentally change humanity's understanding of reality. Her final research notes described plans for an experiment designed to create a controlled intersection point with a parallel dimension. The calculations suggested that such an experiment would require precise timing to coincide with natural electromagnetic phenomena, like the storm that occurred the night she disappeared. Detective Webb consulted with physicists from other universities, hoping to gain insight into whether Dr. Vasquez's theories had any scientific merit, or if she might have been suffering from some form of mental breakdown. The responses were mixed. Several colleagues dismissed her parallel dimension research as highly speculative and potentially the result of academic pressure or personal stress. However, others, particularly those working in cutting-edge quantum physics, acknowledged that her mathematical models were sophisticated and internally consistent, even if the practical applications were far beyond current technological capabilities. One physicist from MIT, Dr. Robert Chun, offered a particularly thoughtful analysis. Elena's work represents the kind of thinking that has led to major scientific breakthroughs throughout history, he explained. It's highly theoretical, certainly, but so was Einstein's work on relativity before it was proven. The question isn't whether her theories are correct, but whether she might have attempted to test them in ways that put her in danger. The investigation took an unexpected turn when maintenance workers discovered that the electromagnetic field generators in Dr. Vasquez's lab had been modified in ways that weren't reflected in any official university documentation. The modifications appeared to significantly amplify the generators, output and focus the electromagnetic fields in specific patterns that matched calculations found in her encrypted research files. The university's electrical engineers confirmed that if activated at full power, the modified equipment could potentially create electromagnetic fields strong enough to cause serious injury or death. Security footage from the building's main entrance showed Dr. Vasquez arriving at 4:30 p.m. on the day of her disappearance, carrying what appeared to be additional equipment in a large backpack. This equipment was never found, and none of her colleagues could identify what it might have been based on the footage alone. Her car remained in the university parking lot, and her apartment showed no signs of hasty departure or struggle. As weeks turned to months, the case gradually faded from public attention, though Dr. Vasquez was never officially declared dead. The university sealed her laboratory and reassigned her research projects to other faculty members, though none of them continued her work on parallel dimensional theory. Her modified electromagnetic equipment was removed and destroyed for safety reasons, and her encrypted research files were archived in a secure digital storage system. Detective Webb continued to review the case periodically, always hoping that new evidence or technological advances might provide fresh insights into what had happened that night in the physics laboratory. He kept in touch with Thomas Park, who eventually completed his graduate degree and moved on to work for a private research company, though he admitted he never forgot the night his mentor disappeared. Years later, during a routine review of cold Cases. Detective Webb discovered that several other universities had reported similar incidents over the past decade. Researchers working on advanced physics projects had vanished under mysterious circumstances, often leaving behind cryptic notes about breakthrough discoveries and modified equipment that exceeded safety parameters. The cases were scattered across different states and had never been connected, but the similarities were too significant to ignore. Asterisk whether Dr. Elena Vasquez had succeeded in her quest to prove the existence of parallel dimensions, had fallen victim to her own dangerous experiments, or had simply chosen to disappear and start a new life, remained one of the most perplexing mysteries in Detective Webb's long career. Her laboratory remained empty, her equations unsolved, and her fate unknown. The blackout murders the city of New Haven, Pennsylvania, had experienced its share of urban challenges over the years, but nothing had prepared residents for the terror that would unfold during the summer blackout of 2023. What began as a routine power grid failure on the sweltering evening of July 23rd would evolve into one of the most chilling murder investigations in the city's history, leaving Detective Lisa Park and her team grappling with questions that seemed to have no answers. The blackout started at 9:47 p.m., affecting the 12-square block area in the city's downtown district. Initial reports from the power company suggested a transformer failure, nothing unusual for a heat wave that had pushed temperatures above 95 degrees for 7 consecutive days. Emergency generators kicked in for essential services, and repair crews were dispatched to restore power as quickly as possible. Under normal circumstances, residents would have expected power to be restored within a few hours, but these were not normal circumstances. During the 3 hours and 22 minutes that the affected area remained in darkness, 4 people would die in ways that defied explanation. The victims appeared to have no connection to each other beyond being in the wrong place at the wrong time during those crucial hours when the familiar comfort of electric lighting gave way to an oppressive darkness that seemed to move with a purpose of its own. Asterisk. The first victim was discovered when power was restored at 1:09 a.m. Michael Torres, a 34-year-old accountant, was found in his third-floor apartment on Maple Street. He was seated in his living room chair, facing the window that overlooked the street below, but he was not alive. The cause of death, according to the medical examiner, was cardiac arrest, which wouldn't have been particularly suspicious except for the fact that Torres was in excellent health with no history of heart problems. More disturbing were the circumstances surrounding his death. Torres's apartment showed no signs of forced entry, and all doors and windows remained locked from the inside. His neighbors reported hearing no unusual sounds from his apartment during the blackout, yet when police arrived, they found every piece of furniture in his living room arranged in a perfect circle around his chair. The furniture was heavy, requiring considerable effort to move, and Torres was not known to be particularly strong. His fingerprints were found on each piece, suggesting he had moved everything himself, but no one could explain why he would have done such a thing in the darkness. The case remained open, but was eventually classified as inactive due to lack of new evidence. Detective Park continued to review the files periodically, hoping that advances in forensic science might eventually explain the unknown compound, or that similar cases might emerge to provide new insights. The affected area of downtown New Haven returned to normal operations, though some residents reported that the area never felt quite the same after the blackout. Urban legends began to circulate about the night of July 23rd, with some claiming that during major electrical storms, sensitive individuals could still hear echoes of the mysterious music that had drawn the victims to their deaths. Whether these stories represented genuine, supernatural phenomena or simply the way communities process traumatic events that resist rational explanation remained as mysterious as the blackout murders themselves. The Collector's final acquisition in the affluent suburb of Westfield Heights. Nestled among tree-lined streets where house prices started in the seven figures, lived a man whose passion for collecting had consumed his life in ways that even his closest neighbors never fully understood. Dr. Harrison Vale was a retired anthropologist whose modest university pension should not have been able to support his lifestyle. Yet his sprawling Victorian mansion was filled with artifacts, artwork, and antiquities that represented decades of careful acquisition and what many suspected was a considerable private fortune. Dr. Vale was known in academic circles as a meticulous researcher with an almost supernatural ability to locate rare and valuable items. His published papers on ancient civilizations were highly regarded, but his private collection far exceeded anything he had ever documented in his scholarly work. He specialized in artifacts related to death rituals and burial practices from cultures around the world, a morbid fascination that had earned him both respect and wariness from his colleagues. On the morning of September 14, 2023, Dr. Vale's housekeeper, Maria Santos, arrived for her weekly cleaning appointment to find the front door of the mansion standing wide open. This was unprecedented in her 8 years of working for the reclusive collector, who was obsessively security conscious and never left doors unlocked, much less standing open. When she called out and received no response, Mrs. Santos contacted the police. Detective Jennifer Walsh arrived at the scene to find a house that looked like a museum had exploded. Dr. Vale's carefully curated collection, normally displayed in precise arrangements throughout the mansion's many rooms, was scattered chaotically across every surface. Ancient pottery lay broken in doorways, rare manuscripts were strewn across floors, and priceless artifacts from dozens of cultures were mixed together in ways that suggested either a thorough ransacking or some form of violent struggle. But there was no sign of Dr. Vale himself, and despite the apparent chaos, nothing appeared to be missing. In fact, Mrs. Santos insisted that there were more items in the house than she remembered from her previous visits. Display cases that had contained specific artifacts now held different pieces, and entire rooms seemed to have been rearranged with new acquisitions that she had never seen before. The mystery deepened when Detective Walsh discovered Dr. Vale's study, a room that Mrs. Santos was never allowed to enter during her regular cleaning visits. The study contained not just artifacts and books, but an elaborate record-keeping system that detailed every item in the collection. Each piece was photographed, cataloged with detailed provenance information, and cross-referenced with acquisition dates, purchase prices, and legal documentation proving ownership. What was disturbing about the records was not what they contained, but what they revealed about the scope of Dr. Vale's collecting activities. According to his meticulous documentation, he had acquired over 3,000 items during the past 5 years, many of them from sources that specialized in legally questionable antiquities. Purchase prices ranged from a few $100s to six-figure sums that far exceeded what a retired professor should have been able to afford. More troubling still were the most recent entries in Dr. Vale's acquisition log. The final entry, dated just 2 days before his disappearance, described an item he called the Eternal Gateway, acquired from a private seller identified only by the initials MR, for the sum of $750,000. The description was uncharacteristically vague for Dr. Vale's usually detailed records. Bronze mirror of unknown origin, approximately 3,000 years old, believed to have been used in ancient death rituals, seller claims. Piece has unusual properties that become apparent only to serious collectors. Provenance uncertain, but seller provided compelling documentation of acquisition from a state of deceased European collector. The mirror described in this entry was nowhere to be found in the house, despite Mrs. Santos insisting that she had seen Dr. Vale carefully unpacking a large mirror-shaped object just days before his disappearance. She described the piece as unlike anything else in his collection, an ornate bronze mirror with intricate carvings around its circumference that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which you viewed them. Detective Walsh's investigation into Dr. Vale's financial situation revealed a complex web of transactions that suggested he had been liquidating legitimate investments and even borrowing against his house to fund his collecting activities. Bank records showed increasingly large withdrawals, often in cash, corresponding to the dates of major acquisitions in his catalog. His accountant, when contacted, expressed concern about Dr. Vale's financial decisions in recent months. He had become obsessed with acquiring one particular piece, the accountant, Robert Kim, explained during his interview. He wouldn't tell me what it was, but he liquidated his entire stock portfolio and took out a significant loan against his house to fund what he called the acquisition of a lifetime. When I warned him about the financial risks, he said that this piece would make all his other collecting seem trivial by comparison. The investigation took on international dimensions when Detective Walsh traced some of Dr. Vale's recent acquisitions to dealers in Europe and Asia. Several of these dealers, when contacted, described him as having become increasingly erratic and demanding in his final months. One dealer in London reported that Dr. Vale had called him repeatedly asking for contacts who specialized in items with active properties, a phrase that made little sense to anyone familiar with normal antiquities. Trading. A dealer in Hong Kong provided the most disturbing account of Dr. Vale's state of mind. According to this source, Dr. Vale had traveled to Hong Kong in July 2023 to examine potential acquisitions, but his behavior had been so unusual that security had escorted him from several establishments. He kept asking about items that were still working, as he put it, the dealer explained via phone interview. When I showed him a beautiful Tang Dynasty mirror, he held it up to his face and stared into it for nearly 10 minutes, muttering about seeing through to the other side. He seemed disappointed when nothing unusual happened and asked if I knew anyone who sold mirrors that showed what they were supposed to show. The search for Dr. Vale expanded beyond his house to include his usual haunts in the academic and collecting communities. His colleagues at the university reported that he had not been seen on campus for several weeks before his disappearance, which was unusual since he maintained an office there and often used the library for his research. His few personal friends described him as having become increasingly isolated and secretive, obsessed with what he called his final acquisition. 3 months after Dr. Vale's disappearance, Detective Walsh received an unexpected lead from an unlikely source. A demolition crew working on an abandoned warehouse in the city's industrial district had discovered what appeared to be an illegal antiquities storage facility. The warehouse contained hundreds of artifacts, many of them matching descriptions of items that had been reported stolen from museums and private collections around the world. Among the recovered items was a bronze mirror that matched the description of the Eternal Gateway from Dr. Vale's acquisition records. The mirror was indeed extraordinary, an ancient piece covered with intricate carvings that seemed to create optical illusions when viewed from different angles. But what made the mirror truly unusual was its surface, which reflected images with a clarity and depth that seemed impossible for bronze that was supposedly thousands of years old. When Detective Walsh looked into the mirror during the evidence cataloging process, she experienced something that she later described as the most disturbing moment of her career. For just an instant, she saw not her own reflection, but the face of Dr. Harrison Vale, his eyes wide with terror and his mouth open as if screaming, though no sound emerged. The image lasted only a second before returning to a normal reflection, but it was vivid enough that Detective Walsh stepped away from the mirror and requested that it be immediately sealed as evidence. The warehouse investigation revealed connections to an international smuggling ring that had been moving stolen antiquities through a network of collectors who were willing to purchase items of questionable provenance. Dr. Vale's name appeared on several transaction records, confirming that he had been involved with the organization for at least 2 years before his disappearance. But the smuggling ring's members, when eventually arrested, claimed to know nothing about Dr. Vale's final fate. According to their testimony, he'd become increasingly unstable and difficult to work with, demanding access to items that they described as being beyond their normal inventory. The mirror found in the warehouse had been intended for delivery to Dr. Vale, but he had disappeared before the transaction could be completed. The case remained officially open, though Dr. Vale was never found and no additional evidence of his fate emerged. The bronze mirror was eventually transferred to a federal facility that specialized in storing evidence related to international art theft cases, where it remained in a secure, climate-controlled environment. Several people who worked with the evidence reported unusual experiences when near the mirror, including unexplained reflections and a persistent feeling of being watched, but these reports were generally dismissed as the result of suggestion. And the unsettling nature of the case. Dr. Vale's mansion was eventually sold to pay his debts, and his collection was dispersed through estate sales and auctions. Mrs. Santos, his former housekeeper, attended one of the estate sales and later told Detective Walsh that the atmosphere in the house felt completely different without Dr. Vale's presence. It was as if the house itself was relieved, she explained. All those years, I felt like the artifacts were watching me while I cleaned, but after he disappeared, they just seemed like ordinary old things again. Whether Dr. Harrison Vale had fallen victim to the criminal organization he had been dealing with, had discovered something about his final acquisition that proved fatal, or had simply chosen to disappear and assume a new identity remained one of the most perplexing mysteries in Detective Walsh's experience. The bronze mirror, with its impossible clarity and disturbing reflections, remained locked away in federal storage, a silent witness to events that might never be fully understood. The Rosewood Apartments complex was one of those sleek, modern developments that had sprung up around Austin in the previous decade. 5 stories of glass and steel, with 240 units housing everyone from tech workers to University of Texas PhD candidates. It was the kind of place where neighbors might nod politely in the hallway, but rarely knew each other's names, where the sound of footsteps above your head and music through thin walls was just part of urban living. Detective Lisa Park had been assigned to the case that began on August 18, 2023, when residents of the Rosewood Apartments began reporting strange disturbances during the night. At first, the complaints seemed routine, typical neighbor disputes about noise levels and inconsiderate behavior. But as Park began investigating, she discovered a pattern that was anything but typical. The first report came from Jennifer Walsh, a graphic designer who lived in Unit 4B on the 4th floor. Walsh told Park that for 3 consecutive nights, she had been awakened around 2:30 a.m. by the sound of someone walking in the hallway outside her apartment. But these weren't normal footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and seemed to stop directly outside her door for several minutes before moving on. What made Walsh's report unusual was her description of the footsteps themselves. She insisted they sounded like someone wearing heavy boots, possibly work boots or hiking boots, but with an odd, scuffing quality that suggested the person might be dragging their feet slightly. She had looked through her peephole during these incidents but never saw anyone in the hallway. Over the next week, similar reports came in from residents on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors. The complaints were remarkably consistent. Footsteps between 2 o'clock and 3 a.m., always stopping outside apartment doors. Always the same heavy scuffing sound. Building security reviewed the hallway cameras but found nothing unusual during the reported times. The footage showed empty hallways throughout the night hours, with no evidence of any person walking the corridors. Park initially assumed the reports were the result of nerves and suggestion. Once one person reported hearing mysterious footsteps, others began listening more carefully and interpreting normal building sounds as something sinister. But her skepticism began to waver when she received a call from Marcus Chun, a graduate student in audio engineering who lived in Unit 5C. Chun had done something that none of the other residents had thought to do. He had recorded the sounds. Using professional audio equipment that he used for his research, Chun had captured nearly 30 minutes of what he described as anomalous acoustic phenomena occurring in the hallway outside his apartment. When Park listened to the recording, she heard exactly what the residents had described: slow, heavy footsteps that seemed to pause outside apartment doors before moving on. But Chun's analysis of the recording revealed something even more puzzling. The audio showed that the footsteps weren't coming from the hallway at all. According to his technical analysis, the sounds were originating from inside the walls themselves, as if someone were walking through the building's internal structure. This seemed impossible. The building plan showed no crawl spaces or maintenance. Areas large enough for a person to move through. Park contacted the building's management company and requested detailed architectural plans for the Rosewood apartments. What she discovered was that the building had been constructed with an unusually complex system of utility corridors and ventilation shafts, designed to accommodate the building's advanced climate control and smart home systems. These corridors were supposedly too narrow for human access, but Park decided to investigate personally. Accompanied by a building engineer named Tom Rodriguez, Park accessed the utility areas through a maintenance entrance in the basement. What they found was a network of corridors that, while narrow, were not as impossible to navigate as the building plans had suggested. Someone small and determined could potentially move through these spaces, though it would be extremely uncomfortable and claustrophobic. But if someone was using the utility corridors to move through the building, Park couldn't figure out why. There was no evidence of vandalism, no signs that anyone was attempting to break into apartments, and no reports of theft or other crimes. The mysterious walker seemed to be doing nothing more than walking, pausing, and walking some more. Case took a more serious turn on September 3rd when resident Amanda Foster called 911 in a panic. Foster, who lived in Unit 3D, reported that the footsteps had stopped outside her door, as usual, around 2:30 a.m. But this time, she heard something else, a low, rhythmic knocking sound coming from inside her walls. The knocking had continued for about 10 minutes before stopping, leaving Foster too frightened to sleep for the rest of the night. Park responded to Foster's apartment the next morning and conducted a thorough investigation. She found no signs of entry or tampering, but she did notice something odd. The wall where Foster had heard the knocking was adjacent to one of the building's main utility corridors. When Park examined the corridor from the building side, she found something that made her blood run cold. Fresh scratches in the metal ductwork that looked like they had been made by human fingernails. The investigation intensified as Park began to suspect that someone was indeed living within the building's walls. But despite extensive searches with thermal imaging equipment and additional security cameras installed in the utility areas, investigators found no trace of an intruder. The building's management hired a private security firm to conduct round-the-clock patrols, but the footsteps and wall knocking continued. As September turned to October, the disturbances began to escalate. Residents reported hearing not just footsteps and knocking, but also what sounded like whispered conversations coming from inside the walls. The conversations were always too muffled to understand, but they seemed to involve at least two different voices, one higher pitched than the other. Park brought in audio specialists from the Austin Police Department's Technical Services Division to analyze the recordings that residents had made. The analysis confirmed that sounds were indeed coming from within the building's structure, but it also revealed something unexpected. The acoustic properties of the sound suggested they were being amplified and distorted by the building's ventilation system in ways that made it impossible to determine their true origin. The case took its most disturbing turn on October 15th when maintenance worker Carlos Mendez made a discovery that changed the entire investigation. Mendez was performing routine maintenance in the basement utility area when he found a small camping setup hidden behind a large water heater. The setup included a sleeping bag, several bottles of water, packages of energy bars, and a collection of detailed floor plans for the Rosewood apartments. But the most unsettling discovery was a notebook filled with handwritten observations about the building's residents. The notebook contained detailed schedules of when different tenants came and went, descriptions of their daily routines, and even speculation about their personal relationships and financial situations. The handwriting was small and precise, suggesting someone who was methodical and patient in their observations. Park immediately launched a full-scale investigation to determine who had been living in the building's basement and spying on residents. Fingerprint analysis of the camping equipment yielded several partial prints, but they didn't match anyone in criminal databases. DNA testing of hair and saliva found on the water bottles was more promising. It belonged to a female, approximately 25 to 35 years old, with European ancestry. The investigation led Park to review the building's rental applications and employee records, looking for anyone who might match the genetic profile and have both the motivation and opportunity to conduct such extensive surveillance. What she found was puzzling. No current or former employee or resident matched the profile, and there were no obvious signs of how someone could have gained long-term access to the building's restricted areas. Asterisk. The breakthrough came when Park decided to expand her search beyond people with direct connections to the building. She contacted other apartment complexes in the area to see if they had experienced similar incidents. What she discovered was a pattern that stretched across Austin's urban core. 5 other apartment buildings had reported similar disturbances over the previous 18 months, always following the same pattern of nighttime footsteps, wall knocking, and eventual discovery of camping equipment in utility areas. Working with detectives from other jurisdictions, Park began to piece together the activities of someone they started calling the urban nomad, an individual who seemed to specialize in finding ways to live undetected within the infrastructure of modern apartment buildings. The pattern suggested someone with extensive knowledge of building construction and security systems, someone who could identify the weaknesses in even well-designed buildings. But the identity of the urban nomad remained a mystery. Despite extensive investigation, police were never able to determine who was responsible for the surveillance and illegal habitation. The incidents at the Rosewood apartments stopped abruptly. In late October 2023, just as suddenly as they had begun, residents gradually returned to normal sleep patterns, though many reported that they never quite felt as secure in their homes as they had before. Park's final report on the case concluded that the perpetrator was likely someone with professional experience in building construction or security systems, possibly someone who had fallen through society's cracks and developed an elaborate method of survival that depended on remaining invisible within the urban landscape. The technical sophistication of the surveillance and the detailed knowledge of building systems suggested education and training, but the lifestyle pointed to social isolation and possible mental health issues. The Rosewood apartments installed additional security measures and sealed access points to the utility corridors, but Park knew that somewhere in Austin, or perhaps in another city entirely, the urban nomad was probably studying building plans and identifying the next target. The case remained officially open, classified as stalking and illegal trespass, but with no new leads or incidents. It gradually faded into the Austin Police Department's cold case files. For the residents of the Rosewood apartments, life returned to normal, but many of them still find themselves listening more carefully to the sounds of the building at night. They know that the walls around them are not as solid and secure as they once seemed, and that sometimes the most unsettling mysteries are not the ones that happen in dark forests or abandoned buildings, but in the spaces where we think we are most safe. Detective Sarah Chun had been with the Oregon State Police for 12 years, but she'd never seen anything quite like what she encountered that Tuesday morning. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. from the conductor of the Coast Starlight, Amtrak's daily service between Seattle and Los Angeles. The train had made its scheduled stop at Millbrook Station at 6:15, as it had every day for decades. But when it was time to depart, something was wrong. The station platform was empty, which wasn't unusual for a Tuesday morning in March. What was unusual was the complete absence of station manager Robert Hensley, who had worked that same shift for 19 years and had never missed a day. His car was in the parking lot. His coffee was still warm in the office. His jacket hung on the back of his chair. But Robert Hensley was nowhere to be found. The conductor, a man named Jim Torres who'd been running this route for 8 years, said he remembered seeing Hensley wave from the office window as the train approached. It was their usual morning ritual. Torres would sound the horn twice, Hensley would wave, and the train would glide to a stop. But when Torres looked again after the train had stopped, the office was dark and empty. Detective Chun arrived at the station 45 minutes later, accompanied by her partner, Detective Mike Rawlings. The first thing she noticed was how normal everything looked. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Hensley's personal belongings were all accounted for, his wallet in his desk drawer, his keys on the hook by the door. Even his wedding ring, which his wife later confirmed he never removed. The office door was unlocked, which was standard procedure during operating hours. The computer was still logged in, showing that Hensley had been updating the morning reports just minutes before the train's arrival. Security cameras covered most of the platform, but in a cruel twist of fate, the system had experienced a malfunction during the night. The hard drive showed nothing but static from 11:47 p.m. on March 14th until 7:23 a.m. on March 15th. As Chun and Rawlings began their investigation, they discovered details that only deepened the mystery. The station's restroom showed signs of recent use. The seat was up, which was odd because Hensley always left it down, a habit his wife had ingrained in him over 23 years of marriage. The paper towel dispenser had been used, leaving a single sheet hanging half out. But perhaps most puzzling was what they found in the trash can, a business card for a company called Meridian Logistics, with a Portland address and phone number. When Chung called the number on the card, she reached a disconnected line. Further investigation revealed that no such company existed at the Portland address listed, and no business license had ever been issued to Meridian Logistics in the state of Oregon. The card itself appeared to be freshly printed, with crisp edges and bright colors that suggested it hadn't been sitting in anyone's wallet for long. Hensley's wife, Margaret, was devastated but cooperative. She told investigators that her husband had been acting normally in recent weeks, with no signs of depression, anxiety, or unusual behavior. Their marriage was stable, their finances secure, and Robert had been looking forward to their upcoming trip to visit their daughter in San Francisco. The only thing slightly out of the ordinary, she mentioned, was that Robert had received several phone calls over the past month from someone claiming to be conducting a survey about railroad operations. He'd found the calls odd because they always came during his work hours, and the questions seemed unusually detailed. The investigation expanded to include interviews with every person in Millbrook who might have had contact with Hensley in the days leading up to his disappearance. The picture that emerged was of a man who lived a remarkably routine life. He woke at 4:30 every morning, arrived at the station by 5:15, and followed the same schedule every single day. He ate lunch at exactly noon, always a sandwich Margaret packed for him. He left work at 3:30 and stopped at Murphy's hardware store to chat with the owner, Bill Murphy, about the weather or the Mariners' chances that season. But Murphy told investigators something interesting. On March 14th, the day before Hensley disappeared, their conversation had been different. Instead of their usual small talk, Hensley had asked Murphy about security systems, specifically about motion sensors and how they worked. Murphy thought it was an odd question, but assumed Hensley was thinking about upgrading the station's security. Looking back, Murphy wished he'd asked more questions. The search for Robert Hensley consumed the small community. Volunteers scoured the surrounding forests, divers checked the nearby Millbrook River, and search and rescue teams brought in dogs to track any scent they could find. The dogs picked up Hensley's trail from the station office to the platform, where it seemed to simply vanish near the spot where the train would have stopped. It was as if he had walked to the edge of the platform and disappeared into thin air. 3 weeks into the investigation, Chun received a call that changed everything. A retired railroad worker named Eddie Vasquez, who lived in Salem, had seen the news coverage about Hensley's disappearance. Vasquez told Chun that he'd been on the platform at Millbrook Station on the morning of March 15th, waiting for a friend who was supposed to arrive on the Coast Starlight. But the friend never showed up, and Vasquez had left confused and worried. What made Vasquez's account remarkable was his claim that he had seen Hensley that morning, but not in the way anyone expected. According to Vasquez, he had arrived at the station around 5:45 a.m. and seen Hensley through the office window, going about his usual morning routine. But then, just as the train was approaching, Vasquez said he saw a second figure emerge from behind the station building. This person, who Vasquez described as tall and wearing dark clothing, approached Hensley on the platform just as the train was slowing down. The strange part of Vasquez's story was what happened next. He claimed that instead of any kind of confrontation or struggle, Hensley seemed to recognize the figure and walked with them toward the train. But here's where the account became truly bizarre. Vasquez insisted that he saw both Hensley and the unknown person board the train, not as passengers, but by climbing onto the freight car coupling area between two cars. When the train departed, they departed with it. Chun was skeptical of Vasquez's account, especially given that no one else had reported seeing anything unusual. But she couldn't ignore the possibility that there might be truth in his story. She contacted Amtrak authorities and requested that they search the train when it reached its next major stop in Sacramento. The search turned up nothing unusual, but investigators noted that the Coast Starlight had made several unscheduled stops between Millbrook and Sacramento due to a signal problem near Eugene. As spring turned to summer, the investigation began to stall. Federal authorities had been brought in because of the potential connection to the railway system, but they found no evidence of terrorism or organized crime. The FBI's behavioral analysis unit suggested that Hensley might have staged his own disappearance, but they couldn't provide a compelling motive. His financial records showed no unusual activity. His medical records revealed no serious health problems, and psychological evaluation of his friends and family indicated no signs of severe mental distress. The breakthrough came in an unexpected way. In July 2023, 4 months after Hensley's disappearance, a hiker named Jessica Palmer was exploring an abandoned logging road about 30 miles southeast of Millbrook when she made a disturbing discovery. Hidden beneath a pile of fallen branches and old-growth debris, she found a duffel bag containing clothes that Margaret Hensley later identified as belonging to her husband. The bag also contained $3,000 in cash, a prepaid cell phone that had never been used, and a Greyhound bus ticket to Portland dated March 16, 2023, one day after Hensley's disappearance. But perhaps most intriguingly, the bag contained a handwritten note in Hensley's own handwriting that read simply, "The surveys were real. I had to know the truth. Don't look for me." This discovery raised more questions than it answered. How had the bag ended up 30 miles from Millbrook? If Hensley had left voluntarily, why abandon money and a means of transportation? And what did he mean by "the surveys were real"? Shun returned to her investigation of the mysterious phone calls Hensley had received. Working with phone company records, she was able to trace the calls to a series of burner phones purchased in different Oregon cities over a 3-month period. The purchasing pattern suggested someone who was deliberately trying to avoid detection, someone with knowledge of how law enforcement tracks communications. The case took another strange turn in September when Margaret Hensley received a postcard. In the mail, the postcard showed a picture of Mount Hood and bore a Portland postmark dated September 12, 2023. On the back, written in what appeared to be Robert's handwriting, was a message: "I'm safe. The truth was bigger than I expected. Take care of yourself." Our handwriting analysis confirmed that the writing was consistent with Robert Hensley's hand, but the analysis also noted subtle differences that suggested the writer might have been under stress or deliberately trying to alter their natural writing style. The postcard was tested for fingerprints and DNA, but yielded no useful evidence. As autumn arrived in Millbrook, the investigation officially transitioned from a missing person case to a cold case. Chun had followed every lead, interviewed dozens of people, and analyzed hundreds of pieces of evidence. But Robert Hensley remained as much of a mystery as he had been on that March morning when he simply vanished from the platform. The town gradually returned to its normal rhythm, though the empty station office served as a constant reminder of the mystery. Amtrak hired a replacement station manager, a young woman from Portland who had no idea about the strange history of her new workplace. The Coast Starlight continued its daily stops, and life in Millbrook went on, but with an underlying sense that something fundamental had changed. Detective Chen retired from the Oregon State Police in December 2023, but she never stopped thinking about the Hensley case. In her final report, she wrote that she believed Robert Hensley had left Millbrook voluntarily, possibly to investigate something related to the mysterious phone surveys he had been receiving. But she also acknowledged that his disappearance involved elements that suggested careful planning by someone other than Hensley himself. The questions remain unanswered to this day. Who was conducting the surveys, and why? What truth was Robert Hensley seeking? And most puzzling of all, if he left voluntarily, why did he abandon the money and bus ticket that would have helped him start a new life? The Millbrook station remains a stop on the Coast Starlight's daily journey, but for those who remember that March morning in 2023, it will always be the place where a man walked out of his ordinary life and into a mystery that no one has been able to solve. The case that would consume the Clearwater Police Department began on October 8, 2023, when the town's longtime librarian, Eleanor Hartwell, failed to open the Clearwater Public Library for the first time in 23 years. Eleanor was a fixture in the community, a 68-year-old widow who had dedicated her life to maintaining the town's modest collection of books and serving as the unofficial keeper of Clearwater's history and memory. When concerned residents found the library still locked at 10:30 a.m., they called Police Chief David Morrison. Morrison had known Eleanor for most of his life. She had been his high school English teacher before becoming the librarian, and she had helped his own children with research projects and summer reading programs. The idea that Eleanor would simply not show up for work was so foreign to Morrison that his first thought was that she must have had a medical emergency. Morrison drove to Eleanor's small house on Maple Street and found her car in the driveway, her morning newspaper still on the front steps, and no response to his knocking. Using a spare key that Eleanor kept hidden under a flower pot, a small-town habit that would have horrified urban police officers, Morrison entered the house and began searching for Eleanor. What he found was a house that appeared perfectly normal in every way except for the complete absence of its owner. Eleanor's bed was made, her coffee maker was set up for morning brewing but had never been activated, and her purse and keys were sitting on the kitchen counter where she apparently left them every evening. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and no indication that Eleanor had packed any belongings for a trip. Asterisk. But there was something odd that Morrison noticed immediately. Eleanor's house was notably neat and organized. She was known throughout Clearwater for her meticulous habits and attention to detail. But in her home office, which doubled as a research area where she worked on local history projects, there were signs of unusual activity. File cabinets that were normally locked were standing open. Papers were scattered across her desk in a way that seemed uncharacteristic, and her computer was still running, showing that she had been working late into the night. Morrison called. In the State Bureau of Investigation, knowing that his small department lacked the resources to handle what might be a serious crime. Special Agent Rachel Torres arrived from Minneapolis that afternoon and immediately began a systematic investigation of Eleanor's disappearance. Torres discovered that Eleanor had been working on something she called the Clearwater Files, a comprehensive historical research project that she had begun 6 months earlier. According to Eleanor's notes, the project had started as a simple effort to digitize the town's historical records for preservation, but it had evolved into something much more complex and potentially controversial. The files that Torres found in Eleanor's office revealed a side of Clearwater's history that few residents knew about. Eleanor had uncovered evidence of financial irregularities dating back decades, questionable land deals involving prominent families, and what appeared to be a systematic cover-up of several incidents that had never been properly investigated by local authorities. One folder contained Eleanor's research into the disappearance of a teenage girl named Susan Kovac in 1987. The official police report, which Torres obtained from archived files, indicated that Susan had run away from home after an argument with her parents and was presumed to have left town. But Eleanor's research suggested a different story. She had tracked down former classmates and friends of Susan's who said that Susan had been planning to expose some kind of wrongdoing involving a local businessman, but she had disappeared before she could tell anyone what she had discovered. Another folder focused on a series of suspicious deaths that had occurred in Clearwater over a 15-year period, from 1995 to 2010. These deaths had all been ruled accidental or natural, but Eleanor had found connections between the victims that suggested they might have been targeted. All of the deceased had either worked for the city government or had been involved in local business dealings that Eleanor believed might have been corrupt. But the most explosive material in Eleanor's files related to current events and people who were still alive and active in the community. Eleanor had uncovered evidence that suggested ongoing financial irregularities involving the city's development projects, including the construction of a new shopping complex that had been championed by Mayor Robert Kenney and several members of the city council. Torres realized that Eleanor's research might have uncovered information that someone was desperate to keep hidden. The timing of Eleanor's disappearance, just as she was apparently preparing to make her findings public, suggested that her historical research project had evolved into something more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The investigation took on new urgency when Torres discovered that Eleanor had scheduled a meeting with an investigative journalist from the Minneapolis Star-Tribune for October 9th, one day after her disappearance. Eleanor's calendar showed that she had planned to share her Clearwater files with the journalist, potentially exposing decades of covered-up crimes and corruption in the small town. Torres expanded her investigation to include interviews with every person mentioned in Eleanor's files. Many of these individuals were prominent members of the Clearwater community, business owners, retired city officials, and longtime residents who had never been associated with any kind of criminal activity. But as Torres dug deeper, she began to uncover a network of relationships and financial dealings that painted a picture of systematic corruption that had been hidden beneath the town's wholesome exterior for decades. The case became even more complex when Torres discovered that Eleanor had been in contact with several other people who had attempted to investigate Clearwater's hidden history over the years. Phone records showed that Eleanor had been communicating with a former newspaper reporter named Michael Garrett, who had left town suddenly in 2018 after trying to write a series of articles about municipal corruption. Garrett had apparently been gathering information similar to what Eleanor had compiled, But he had abandoned his research after receiving what he described as credible threats against his safety. Torres managed to track down Garrett, who was living in Portland and working as a freelance writer. Garrett told Torres that his investigation into Clearwater had uncovered evidence of a long-running criminal enterprise that involved money laundering, tax fraud, and possibly more serious crimes. He said that shortly before he left town, he had received anonymous phone calls warning him to drop his investigation, and that his car had been vandalized in a way that seemed designed to send a message, rather than cause random property damage. Garrett's account suggested that Eleanor might not have been the first person to disappear after getting too close to Clearwater's secrets. He told Torres that during his research, he had found references to several other individuals over the years who had either left town suddenly or had died under circumstances that seemed suspicious in retrospect. Eleanor's files apparently represented the most comprehensive attempt to document and expose the truth about what Garrett called the Clearwater conspiracy. As November arrived, Torres felt she was getting closer to understanding what had happened to Eleanor, but she was also becoming concerned about her own safety. The investigation had revealed that corruption in Clearwater went to the highest levels of local government and involved people who had both the motivation and the resources to eliminate threats to their criminal enterprise. The breakthrough came when Torres received an anonymous tip that led her to a storage unit on the outskirts of town. Inside the unit, she found boxes of documents that appeared to be Eleanor's backup copies of the Clearwater files, along with additional evidence that Eleanor had gathered but had not yet organized into her main research. The storage unit had been rented 3 days before Eleanor's disappearance, suggesting that she had anticipated the possibility that her home files might be compromised. But the storage unit also contained something that chilled Torres to the bone, a video recording that Eleanor had made of herself explaining her research and naming the specific individuals she believed were involved in the criminal conspiracy. In the recording, Eleanor stated that she was making the video as a form of insurance, in case something happened to her before she could share her findings with authorities. The video revealed that Eleanor had uncovered evidence of a criminal organization that had been operating in Clearwater for over 30 years, using the town's small size and close-knit community as cover for activities that included money laundering for organized crime groups in Minneapolis and Chicago. According to Eleanor's research, the organization had been responsible for several deaths over the years, all of which had been successfully disguised as accidents or natural causes. Eleanor's video named names, provided specific dates and financial information, and presented a compelling case that Clearwater had been home to a criminal enterprise that had generated millions of dollars over the decades. But the video also revealed that Eleanor knew she was in danger. She stated that she had recently become aware that her research activities were being monitored, and that she had reason to believe that her life was in jeopardy. Torres immediately shared Eleanor's findings with federal authorities, recognizing that the scope of the alleged criminal activity was beyond the capabilities of state investigators. The FBI launched a major investigation into the Clearwater conspiracy, leading to a series of arrests and indictments that shocked the small community. But Eleanor Hartwell was never found. Despite extensive searches and the arrest of several individuals who were believed to be involved in her disappearance, Eleanor's fate remains unknown. The investigation revealed that she had indeed uncovered a major criminal conspiracy, and that her research had posed a serious threat to people who had killed before to protect their secrets. The Clearwater files that Eleanor compiled ultimately led to the conviction of 12 individuals on charges ranging from money laundering to racketeering to conspiracy to commit murder. Mayor Robert Kenney was among those convicted, along with several other prominent members of the community who had used their positions to facilitate criminal activities for decades. But for the people of Clearwater, the resolution of the criminal cases provided little comfort. Their town had been revealed as the home of a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades. And the woman who had exposed the truth had paid the ultimate price for her courage and dedication to justice. That Special Agent Torres concluded that Eleanor Hartwell had almost certainly been murdered to prevent her from exposing the Clearwater conspiracy. But the evidence needed to prosecute her killers had been carefully destroyed by individuals who had spent decades perfecting their methods of avoiding accountability. The Clearwater Public Library now has a new librarian, a young woman from St. Paul who has no knowledge of the town's dark history. The library's local history section has been reorganized and expanded, with a special collection dedicated to Eleanor Hartwell's memory. But the people of Clearwater know that their town's story will never be quite as simple or innocent as it once seemed. Eleanor's research taught the community that even in places where everyone thinks they know everyone else's business, the most important secrets can remain hidden for decades. Her disappearance serves as a reminder that the pursuit of truth can be dangerous, and that sometimes the price of justice is paid by those who are brave enough to shine light into the darkest corners of their world. And so we come to the end of another night's journey through the shadows that hide just beneath the surface of ordinary life. These three stories, the vanishing of Robert Hensley from the Millbrook train platform, the mysterious presence that haunted the Rosewood Apartments in Austin, and the disappearance of Eleanor Hartwell as she uncovered decades of corruption in Clearwater, remind us that mystery and danger can find us anywhere, at any time. Perhaps Robert Hensley found the truth he was seeking, somewhere far from the small Oregon town where he spent his quiet, predictable life. Perhaps the urban nomad still moves through the hidden spaces of our cities, observing and cataloging the lives of people who never suspect they're being watched. And perhaps Eleanor Hartwell's sacrifice will ensure that the truth she died for continues to protect others from the corruption she exposed. These stories remain unfinished because life rarely provides the neat conclusions we find in novels and movies. Real mysteries linger, real questions remain unanswered, and real people disappear into shadows that investigators may never fully illuminate. But in their mystery, these stories connect us to something fundamental about the human experience, our need to understand the world around us, our vulnerability in the face of forces we can't control, and our resilience in continuing to search for truth, even when the search leads into dangerous territory. As you drift toward sleep tonight, wherever you are in the world, whatever time your clock shows, let these stories remind you that every ordinary day contains the possibility of extraordinary mystery.